Hey everybody, this is Rydo, and we're back to another live stream of Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel and video game news. Today is Friday, January 26th. So, yeah, starting late today. In part, that's because I spent yesterday doing a decent amount of stuff. I've played in the festival, and as it sometimes seems to be the case, when you get late in the festivals and there's only a couple days left, you seem to start to get more success. So I think as far as the Themed Chronicle Festival goes, we have done everything. We've got maybe a little bit of daily quests to do today and some logins. But yeah, put a lot of extra time in playing the Themed Festival to try and catch up and try and get that second icon. I did get past the first icon. And if anything, while I was paying attention, I actually learned how to play a deck, at least somewhat well. So we'll hop into that fairly quickly. Otherwise, for the accountability section, I also started playing another game and making some pre-recorded footage, which just at this point I think means that my Smart On Air sign is backburnered until I can try and muster up some enthusiasm for working on it again, which, I mean, it's just incredibly stupid. I should just power through it, but I'm just not feeling it. What can I say? And yeah, quitting on something I really shouldn't quit on is dumb and not good. At a certain level, I guess I could make arguments that I've stuck with the YouTube channel for probably about 10 years now, it feels like. I haven't quit on that, but inherently that is something that any sane person, anybody trying to actually make any money on YouTube, should have quit after 3 or 4 years of trying. Honestly, you really shouldn't even start on YouTube. Like, I mean, you can give it a year at most, but that's about it. Which is perhaps the one argument to go ahead and let a teenager try to be a YouTube star, but almost certainly people could do better with their time than doing YouTube. Of course, there is always that 1 in a billion win the lottery, 1 in a trillion chance that you would become popular, but honestly, I don't even think I can name, or that there actually even is, a majorly successful newcomer to YouTube in the past couple of years. And you certainly have people giving up and retiring and just slowing down, like PewDiePie. And almost every successful channel that is possibly new to YouTube secretly has entire production companies behind it and is just getting way more funding and support than a random person would. And one assumes that there's some really big negotiations happening in the background to make that make some sense. Yeah. Even 5 to 7 years ago, I would say that a significant amount of even moderately successful YouTube channels were actually groups of similarly aligned YouTube channels with the same production company kind of running in the background. If you have 5 different channels and then you're doing a whole bunch of collabs between these 5 different channels all the time, then maybe that works. Maybe. So the game I started playing, I think it's called Puzzle Chambers. It's a top-down math puzzle game that seems to have a little bit more story than you might really need. But at a certain level too, there is just a question as far as how complicated the math puzzles could be. It's somewhat like Sudoku without strictly following the Sudoku rules. It definitely feels like it is a variation on something like a Sudoku as far as a number crossword puzzle or a cross number puzzle would go. With a story that is heavily referencing movies like Cube and Saw, and people are trapped in it in the chambers. But comparing that to like Rethink, I do think Puzzle Chambers, which is also coincidentally a second 2017 game, yeah. So compared to Rethink, which is a Unity Store asset flip, the new version of Rethink in particular is a Unity Store first-person 3D laser puzzle game. Puzzle Chambers has this top-down 2D animation, and in all fairness, the characters may also be from the Unity asset store. It too is a Unity game, but it just makes a lot more sense overall to have that kind of have a top-down 2D game for puzzle games, particularly if you're making it in Unity, and particularly if you're trying to target the possibility of porting it to things like the Nintendo Switch, or porting it to consoles in general. Now, there is one weird thing about Puzzle Chambers, and I don't know if this is just a case where they stupidly added a filter that makes it look pixely. There's just a noise filter effectively over the entire screen, or if maybe this is supposed to indicate a flashback. But if it was supposed to indicate a flashback, I would have to say they are going far too long with that. It still didn't work for me, did it? Like, yeah. It would make sense if you did 5, maybe 10 puzzles, and then there was a fuzziness and that indicated a flashback, and then you would be in the modern time frame, and then the filter would go away. But otherwise, it clearly is a filter, and it clearly just makes everything look worse. And there's no way to turn it off in the options, as far as I can tell. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much all I did. Is I wrapped up playing Rethink in its old version, and started playing Puzzle Chambers, and also spent a lot of time playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And also spent a lot of time watching Farscape. There's a lot of episodes near the end of Season 3 in Farscape that are very memorable, to the point where, even though I haven't watched Farscape in probably a decade or two, I'm still memorizing. I still remember the episodes enough to the point where I don't even want to sit through them and watch them a second time. Every season up to Season 3 teases that would be the last season, and that they would just end on a cliffhanger, and I think that hurts. And then there's a lot of episodes that feel like they're just randomly written by random people, so it definitely doesn't have this interconnected feel where the personalities and the relationships are naturally evolving as much as it really should be the case. Inherently, there are times when at the first season they've already really accepted Eren, so once you fully accepted Eren as a former peacekeeper, former bad guy, they can't really go back and make her some source of conflict, who might be a former bad guy, might be a bad guy again. So you've painted yourself out of that opportunity there. So I just got 300 gems. I definitely would have wanted to get enough medals to get to that, but it still is a case where I'm gonna need 2 wins to get to this spot, 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 and 2 wins to get to this spot. So basically need to get another 20 wins, or maybe. Yeah, particularly in the 3rd season, it feels like there are episodes where sometimes the characters are romantically interested in each other and developing romantic interest, and then the next episode that there's just a little bit less of that, and then the next episode there's more of that, and it's just fairly inconsistent. There's one episode in season 3 that straight up is a flashback to, in part, I suppose, explain how they were making one character come off as more crazy, but then it's just kind of totally out of place, and definitely feels like they aired some episodes out of what would have been the best order. There's, since it's Muppet, Jim Henson, the Muppet Company, that is making the alien suits, they straight up bring in, I believe they're called the Skeksis from Dark Crystal, as an alien species, and I mean it just is the Skeksis. There's no attempt to really change it or make it look any different at all. Which that's, in my opinion, too on the nose. Like, there should have been perhaps a little bit of that, but not a one-to-one using of the Muppets. Farscape is also weird in the way it ends every single episode. It just kind of ends. Like, they'll say something, that there'll be a funny comment or something, so it'll end on like a joke or a laugh, but it otherwise just ends. Like, there isn't the fullest of resolutions of the world or the story or even that one episode right at the end. The resolution has either come, and often the resolution is not 100% set, or it just is never delivered on. Which, yes, I could imagine a lot of writers for TV or any other form factor may struggle with just writing endings. In all fairness, when Farscape was airing too, there was just more of that you would typically have in a show that is more targeting syndication and knows episodes are going to air out of order, and is just really hiring different writers to write different episodes completely. Whereas modern TV now, regardless of what kind of TV you're watching, almost exclusively gives you a next time section, and that's the last thing you see and remember is the teaser and the promise and the advertisement for the next episode to drag you in and make you want to watch the next time. And generally they wrap it up pretty well, even if there isn't a next time section. It's a little strange in Season 3 of Farscape that there is a 3-part episode. That's also something you just generally would not have to do if you were writing a series designed more to be watched in a row. And I think Farscape in particular fails at its attempt to perhaps be a series that could be watched in any order, because you're introducing Chiana as a character, and then you introduce another character pretty much in the 4th season, and then you introduce another character I think in the 5th season, so there is no real consistency there. And I would say I suspect the number of episodes are a little short too. In fairness, these might be criticisms that I would also say about like Star Trek The Next Generation, particularly the 1st season, in that a lot of those 1st season episodes of Next Generation, and pretty much all of the episodes in the original series of Star Trek, are designed to be watched out of order and are not, they really don't know who the characters are or what the characters will be in the future, so they haven't really established anything. Suffice it to say, you can see that this zombie deck definitely is a difficult deck to play, because you're just pressing a lot of buttons, activating a lot of things. I think this guy is probably supposed to be raising his own level. Yeah, and I guess I really don't have too much else to say, so we went really long on Wednesday's stream. I did upload some videos, but I also failed to do what I said I should do, which is make YouTube shorts on Wednesday. I really should be making YouTube shorts on either Monday or Wednesday after a stream, because I'm just not going to accomplish anything there. Instead, I just sit around just goofing off, watching YouTube, things like that, and then a lot of times after I stream I fall asleep, regardless of what time it is. But yeah, I definitely should, on Monday or Wednesday, make YouTube shorts. On Friday, make an effort to schedule YouTube shorts. So the most logical thing would probably be to make YouTube shorts on Monday, upload YouTube shorts on Wednesday, schedule YouTube shorts on Friday, and have more effective self-management of just getting things done. I noticed that Prey is airing on my channel, which that is kind of the beginning of the end as far as scheduled videos goes. I still think I have a lot of videos that are scheduled far in the future. I'm also noticing that not a lot of people are watching Prey, which is kind of a shame. Once again though, that also was one of those sections where something about my computer was not quite working, and started to have the RAM being overclocked too much, which that still feels like that's a big deal. There was an interesting Linus Tech Tips, or one of those shows, where they were talking about how they had bought 12 different AMD CPUs, and there was just a very large difference in the AMD CPUs, relatively speaking. It was like 2 to 10% difference at most. I think it was much closer to 2, plus or minus 2% in performance. But they just could not really get even 3 CPUs to be exactly the same before they even started to add other components that might wildly skew test results. Which, yeah, I don't know if there's even a way you could underclock things to some specific amount, and if you were underclocking things, is that really a real world example at that point? But it's crazy. Like, by the numbers, AMD is way better right now, and buying an Intel CPU sounds like a crazy suggestion, but I would argue that if you want full stability and you don't want something trying to overclock itself, you might be better still, even now, building an Intel CPU, regardless of the fact that almost every CPU in consoles are AMD and ATI graphics cards. The old standby of building an Intel CPU and an NVIDIA graphics card computer still feels like it might be the right choice. Not that the 470 Supers are really great. DF Retro did some reviews on those. This is a great example of when one of these games goes somewhat bad. You have a decent amount of chance that you can turn it around, but regardless of what you're doing, you are going to have to click just a ridiculous amount, which gets you your daily quest done. But that's pretty much all you can praise it for. I did finish watching all of the latest season of Rick and Morty. Fairly disappointed with the whole season. I would have to say it seemed like it was a season that very much were just determined to either continue or conclude storylines that have been, plot threads that have been left hanging from previous seasons, things that honestly you probably didn't need included. Or continued. And it just felt like overall there was not a lot of good jokes in Rick and Morty. And at no point could I really pinpoint the episode where they got rid of, I think it was Jeff Rowland was the name of the guy. But if I was to guess, it would be when they wrapped up the vast majority of the plot line of the of Rick's wife being killed by a alternate version of him called Rick Prime, basically. But yeah. So, that would be my guess where it switched. But pretty much noticeably throughout the season, you never had Rick burping, drinking alcohol and burping. And I imagine that was an indicator of the voice actor actually was probably drinking alcohol or just drinking something and burping into the microphone, and them adding it to the animation and to the character. which that is definitely a very simplistic character trait that you could get rid of, but it kind of also, I think, was just a good establishing character trait. But notably, in the most recent series of Rick and Morty, the one time when they try to do something really wild and crazy there, as far as alien species turning into spaghetti if they kill themselves, and the spaghetti being delicious, and then Rick not telling his family that he's taking the spaghetti from the corpses of this alien species and feeding it to him. Like that's a really irrelevant, silly premise. And they do pretty much nothing comedic with it at all. In fact, they just try to make it feel like it's some kind of serious statement, but even in that, they kind of admit at the end that they're actually not trying to make a statement, or as far as a right to die statement or a suicide statement or anything like that. But so the whole thing just kind of feels like it's a pointless journey. And then they waste an entire episode in Rick and Morty, and there's just not that many episodes. There's like we really are consistently now getting 13 episodes if you're lucky for a season, and we are just really far away from the days when you would have 26 episodes or more per season. But yeah, they waste an entire episode bringing back the Ice-T joke character and continuing something that would have been an after credits gag as if it is something that should have been serious and touched upon. It basically was the equivalent of, and this is probably a very old reference, in a show called Ally McBeal, there was an episode with a dancing CGI baby. If a season later they had come back to that dancing CGI baby hallucination and done an entire episode following the events of the dancing baby, that would have been just so distastefully pandering and ridiculous. So yeah, definitely feels like Rick and Morty has jumped the shark, although arguably I might say that Rick and Morty probably started to jump the shark even the season before, and it is now just in that realm of being a series that will probably go on for a little bit longer than, or way longer than it should, but will never really be that funny ever again. A la something like Family Guy. What is Simpsons? Which, that's a shame. I've also been watching this show called Deadbeat, which is on Hulu as like a Hulu original, and they totally changed it on the third season of that show too. They basically fired everybody except for the main character and killed off the characters. And then they brought in, I think it's Kumail Nanjiani, I think is how you pronounce his name. A hot stoner comedian, which Deadbeat was already designed around one hot stoner comedian character, so it's kind of ridiculous to have two, and it just kind of gives the feeling that they're trying to do something like that movie where Alex and Camille go to White Castle, or whatever the name of that movie is, It's just two pot stoners. Or, yeah. But yeah, there's definitely some weirdness in just kind of rebooting your entire series and introducing a new lead, co-host, co-main protagonist. One of the things I think is really important to point out, though, about Deadbeat is it definitely is a TVMA, too raunchy for its own good series. But it doesn't really benefit if it went further, so it does sometimes have some like blurring of nudity and things, but it's still just in theme too raunchy. There is no serious character in all of it to play off. There's no straight man effectively in the series, so it's just silly events and then silly events and silly events, which might work in a movie. What is that? The Bachelor Party movie series, I think might be the name of it. See if we can change our options here. See, that now lets me get this 2800 or this 3000 by having 8. And if I activate this, do this. And we'll throw that in the graveyard. Now we're at 9. Which lost me options. See, that seems crazy. That I somehow lost options. And I'd have to read the cards to really figure out what is going on there. Okay, well, we'll probably need to talk about video game news. The biggest story by far is going to be that Microsoft has announced just major amounts of layoffs. Now, the initial reaction, the appropriate reaction, is to feel sorry for and side with the workers that are being laid off. But I have to be honest, that this is not unwelcome news to the overall thought process I've had with Microsoft, that particularly when you know that a lot of these layoffs, if not all of them, are from ZeniMax and Activision Blizzard King. Like, inherently, there is no one person that your average gamer could name inside of Activision Blizzard King that they feel like was contributing good to Activision Blizzard King's games. And the same can be said for ZeniMax, the parent company of Bethesda, particularly with Starfield being released. we kind of have to separate ourselves from the nostalgia of a brand name in Bethesda and brand names of Activision and Blizzard and King, all of which are brand names that were popular decades ago and made good games decades ago, but really haven't made anything recently in the past 5 years that was great as far as the quality goes. The brain drain has happened, has long since happened, and the IPs that Microsoft acquired do at least have a better chance of coming out differently now that somebody else potentially is going to be in charge of it. Of course, Microsoft might just sit on the IPs, or they might just hand it to a team that does even worse. That there's no guarantee of improvement, only different. But had Activision Blizzard not been acquired by Microsoft, I think there's a decent chance it would have tried to straight up split itself apart and sell itself off in pieces otherwise, or that it would have just gone completely bankrupt. Regardless, I don't think there was a higher chance, if Microsoft wasn't involved, that any of the games would come out better. There's far too many employees, obviously, at Microsoft in general, let alone Microsoft Gaming. So they needed to, or at least they didn't really need to. They wanted to lay off people anyways. Of course, maybe it is certainly accurate to describe this as victim blaming, to say that the people at Microsoft, at Activision Blizzard King, and Bethesda needed to be fired and they deserve to be fired, but at a certain level it kind of is the case. Notably, I haven't heard any talk, and we don't really have the details yet, but I haven't heard any talk of Microsoft just slashing jobs in general at its other subsidiaries. They are fairly targeting it at ZeniMax, which ZeniMax, when it was acquired, was left alone. So this probably is also a case that where Major Nelson was protecting a bunch of people in their jobs. Maybe that was out of kindness, maybe that was just out of cronyism and protecting his management friends, who knows. But when ZeniMax and Bethesda was acquired a few years ago, that really would have been the appropriate time to evaluate more of ZeniMax. And the fact that ZeniMax even exists still to this point is kind of ridiculous. The next step still is to lay off more people and dissolve ZeniMax, or integrate ZeniMax, if you want to call it that, into being part of just a much flatter management structure for Microsoft Gaming. There really should not be corporations that have subsidiaries of other corporations inside the bigger Microsoft corporation. It's just not efficient. It's not efficient for having everybody on the same field, on the same page, or working at the same time. Quick note here, as we're getting to the end of these of this festival, more and more people are just surrendering and disconnecting once they see that you're doing a decent amount of actions. They just don't want to spend the time on it. So yeah, we have a story here from Video Games Chronicle, not about the layoffs. The Switch 2, or whatever it's called, an analyst is claiming that it will have an 8-inch LCD screen, and it's expected to release this year. There is an interesting thought, certainly, would an 8-inch versus a 7.5-inch screen even be that noticeable? I don't know for certain how big The standard Switch has a screen size of 6.2 inches, while the OLED has 7 inches, and the Switch Lite screen is smaller at 5.5 inches. So they are kind of all over the place on sizes. And I imagine in this alone, we are being told that there is a 0.7 inch difference between here and here, because that's probably where Nintendo determined is the minimum margin you need difference, and then there is a 0.8 difference between standard and OLED, and so then it would be a 0.10 or 1 inch difference from the OLED. There is a certain element to this, though, where reducing the bezels might be appreciated in one way, and then having a larger screen might require an even larger screen. Assuming that the next Nintendo console looks anything like the current Switch, there is definitely a question as far as how big you could even get the screen before it gets just kind of ridiculously large. That there is potentially too big, and there is potentially a case where what you're really looking for is to just have a screen that is edge to edge and has no black bezel at all, particularly if you're doing an LCD screen, because LCD screens do not have pure black pixels, so it will be a more unless there's just a lot of local dimming sections for, and even then you'd still get light bleed with LCD. So yeah, it definitely seems like you could probably only get the screen to be almost edgeless, almost edge to edge. The same is somewhat the same is almost somewhat exactly the same with the Steam Deck, in that the OLED reduced the bezels, and that was very noticeable. I should have activated this ability first, but I chose not to. That was a mistake. If they are talking about a screen, you're still indicating some kind of portable device, at least to some level. It would be quite the shocker, I imagine, if the device had a screen on the controller, but then the controller still was connecting to a TV. And certainly I can talk about bezels on my TV. My much newer TV that's below my much older TV, it's really night and day difference as far as just how thick it is. I have a Sanyo that's probably 15 years old at the top, and it has easily 1.5 inch bezel all around it, and it easily in its thickest part is 4 or 5 inches thick. Below that I have hanging, literally I think hanging on a coat hanger wire that I bent out of straight shape, a TCL that has, I would imagine you would say, about 1/4 inch bezel all around, and in its thickest part is probably 1.5 inches thick. Yeah. So yeah, we are getting thinner TVs, we're getting more bezels. And arguably we're getting too thin TVs, particularly if you're not wrapping up or folding a TV. That there probably should be a level of thickness. They still can't do anything. It's really tough to destroy this 3000 defense character. I did spend a little bit of time just looking on Steam to see if there are media players. Like, I looked to see if VLC had been put on Steam. It doesn't seem like it really has. I looked to see if Cody had been put on Steam as a software thing. I looked at their listing of the kind of software that Steam does allow, because they don't really allow too many categories, but the categories are kind of nebulous. So one of them is under software player tools. I don't know what they mean specifically by saying player tools, though, because I could easily see that player tool would be a media player, MP3 player, music video players, but I could also see it meaning something else. And yeah, if I was going to even begin to think about making a Steam Deck specialized media player that would play music and MP3s, it would undoubtedly have to be VLC. It looks like the license on VLC would let you make your own version of it, and maybe you would have to open source the source code, which wouldn't be too bad of an idea, but then you could still sell it, or maybe, which that seems kind of crazy as a requirement, but whatever. If you're just paying $100 to put something on Steam for a Steam Direct thing, that may not be that big of a deal. But yeah, it would have to just be a lot of work to make a special skin for VLC. Using VLC then to just play the music, and then adding a little bit of code to try to optimize for battery life. I assume that that would all work. It definitely wouldn't be anything as ambitious as making a full program from scratch and optimizing it. And there may literally not be that big of a demand. And it is kind of repeating functionality that is in the Steam overlay, if people remember that the Steam overlay works. Because yes, you can just play music via the Steam overlay. It definitely would make a lot more sense for Valve to optimize a music player specifically for the Steam Deck to potentially save battery life and just treat it much more like a giant iPod shuffle, or just giant iPod video. Yeah. It is a little surprising that things like Kodi, which maybe Kodi would be better than VLC, aren't ported as software to the Steam Deck, and certainly that starts to make more sense with the Steam Deck that you would have software in your Steam Deck that doesn't require you to go to desktop mode to launch an app and run it. pretty obviously takes really, really long amounts of time. Let's just risk it and see if we win. Getting tons of legacy packs still and getting the occasional card, but most of them are useless. Alright, so either I'd have to go through 2 games to lose to get up to this point, then I would need 2 victories for this, 2 victories for this, 2 victories for this, and I think I probably just want to play that stuff off screen in favor of not making this whole stream really long. As far as daily quests go, playing in solo mode in the next 4 days, and Duel Live is pretty much it. All of this is done, and then all of this will disappear. And where are we as far as just the proficiency test? Let's check that too. We've destroyed 65 out of 100 cards, and so we'll eventually just get that. Alright. It's fairly easy to just randomly speculate and guess at saying it'll be an 8-inch screen. If it turned out to be a 7.9-inch screen, people would claim that as a victory. If they claimed it, if it was 7.5, they'd still claim it as a victory. You're not saying anything particularly new or interesting by saying the screen might be better, the bezel might be better. That's just how technology has improved. And frankly, the bezel on the original Switch was just very large because they were using very old stock. There is an entire mentality in how they design their hardware at Nintendo in which they are reusing in what they call creative ways. It's questionable how creative it is sometimes. Very old hardware, established hardware, instead of trying to use the newest, biggest, and brightest hardware. Which makes it a little surprising that there even is no LED version of the Switch at all. At some level, you could see a roll-up screen or a fold flat screen appear on something like the Switch, but it almost certainly would never come from Nintendo. I could certainly see Samsung wanting to promote their roll-up screens and their fold flat screens in that way, and it makes a lot of sense when you're trying to have a still portable but somewhat cinematic experience to potentially roll up or fold the screen flat. Clearly, the way we need to go, and we finally are approaching the point where the technology makes sense, is we need to go to just glasses. They don't inherently have to be called VR glasses, but just some kind of monitors on glasses you put on to see the game, and then disconnected controllers, which the Joy-Cons are already disconnected. They would just have to be slightly redesigned so that you would have a touch feel as far as the location of where buttons are and triggers are. And it's not really VR that's going to bring us to that. It's just going to be a matter of it being very ridiculous to have a device be as large and as flat as the Switch is, when eventually the GPU and CPU is going to just get way smaller than that. And if you're not really having to squeeze the battery flat, even the batteries would take less space up, and the batteries are taking up a vast majority of the Switch. I would say at least a quarter of what's inside the Switch is just battery life. If we got battery technology down, everything would get to be much, much smaller. Power World still going well, and so far Nintendo has just said that they are responding to inquiries by saying they are investigating any potential misuse of their copyright, which is basically all they really could say. Either Nintendo is just going to respond with no comment forever, as they constantly get tweeted this by, let's just assume a lot of them are 12-year-olds on Twitter asking Nintendo. And interestingly, they're asking Nintendo, and they're not even asking the Pokemon Company or Game Freaks, which arguably we'd have to do some deep dive to figure out who actually even owns the rights to Pokemon characters. It's almost certainly the Pokemon Company, not Nintendo. Nintendo may be the publisher, but they also own part of the Pokemon Company, so I suspect that it really would be the Pokemon Company investigating this. And I still heavily suspect, at least in the United States, that the copyright system and parody laws allow for Power World to do what it's doing. And then we'll very quickly probably see other companies doing similar things too. What might be a better case is if they brought it into Japanese law, which, by the way, they sentenced the Kyoto animation studio arsonist to death. He did kill, I think, like 12 people by setting a fire. Now, arguably, the building was not designed or maintained in a safe way that 12 people could be killed in a fire, but regardless, it also seemed to me, and it was argued by his defense to no avail, which is not surprising in Japanese laws, that the arsonist was of diminished capacity / crazy, because the whole reason he started the fire is he believed that the animation studio was stealing his animation. But yeah, they're gonna execute him, and in Japan they just randomly pick a day that they're gonna execute you. They don't tell you, they hang you, which hanging is actually, when done right, pretty efficient. The United States just executed somebody using nitrogen because they can't get a hold of the lethal injection drugs they were using before, and they were running out of other ways to kill people. But yeah, in Japan they just pick a random date. They don't tell you until the day, like the morning of, that you're going to be executed, and then they tell any family of the person being executed that they were executed after the fact. Which obviously that is a system designed not around the idea of appeals, where the United States execution system has so many avenues to exhaust appeals and make sure nothing is done wrongly, as far as whether they're killing the wrong person or not, or at least they try to pretend like that's what they're doing. That somebody on death row takes decades before they're usually executed. And it's way more expensive to execute somebody in the United States than it is to give them a lifetime sentence without any possibility of parole. But yeah, that has nothing to do with Power World. Power World, 8 million gamers, still being super popular. This highlights a disconnect I have, certainly, in that I'm not talking to other gamers per se. Like, you can try and follow people on Reddit, but even there, it's mostly just not the real voice of the real gaming community, as far as I can tell, which is just the weirdness. Like, gamers your average gamer is not going to go onto some kind of Facebook group or Reddit or forum and talk about the games they're hyped about. Even if they are slightly hyped about it, they're going to talk about it amongst their friends and possibly coworkers, and maybe family, and that's it. It's going to be very direct, small peer group circles that you're communicating your enthusiasm with. So the only way you can really tell as an outsider whether a game is being well received or not is by just seeing the SteamDB 24-hour player peak, just to see how big that community of people are that are playing the game, and possibly reviews on Steam, which is just not quite enough. There's no one place on Steam to go to say this game is getting a lot of new reviews recently. Like on the front page, you'd think that there would be something like that, where if you started to get 100 new reviews a day and you were only getting one a month before then, that might indicate some level of enthusiasm, whether it's a positive review bomb or a negative review bomb, or whether it just is you updated your game and more people have seen it now, or people have caught the attention of it. And sadly, that creates a scenario where you're looking at people like Game Grumps that aren't real gamers and seeing if they're playing a game, or you're looking at streamers that aren't often real gamers. They often aren't real gamers. Just seeing what troll joke game they're playing. Let's see, Mike Ybarra seems to have left on his own accord from Blizzard Entertainment, saying it's now time for him to once again be Blizzard's biggest fan from the outside. So Mike Ybarra is a name that I've heard of. He would have been the company president of Blizzard. So, yeah. But you gotta also admit that there's some level of whatever Mike Ybarra has been doing recently with Blizzard hasn't been really what people have wanted. You just look at Diablo 4 and it's a totally different game from what Diablo 2 should have evolved into. Overwatch 2 not being well received. I don't think Hearthstone is doing much. It is also very possible that in these sweeping layoffs, Microsoft is very much cleaning house for what seems to have been proven here to be a boys' club full of sexism amongst the workers at Blizzard and Activision in general. So with these sweeping layoffs, there may just be a whole new a new generation of people that can take the IPs of Diablo and do something better with it. For the longest time, I imagine it's somebody like Mike Ybarra, if not exactly Mike Ybarra, who pushed against having classic servers for World of Warcraft, which is what everybody would want. It's very possible that somebody like Mike Ybarra, if not him, has been putting a stopper in the path of bringing back Warcraft 1, Warcraft 2, like making remasters of that, just porting it so those games are even available for playability. StarCraft 1 and 2, not playable. Like, the classic Blizzard games have had no love put on them at all, let alone remakes of like Diablo 1 and Diablo 2, which all of those things should have at least been on Battle.net, and there should have been ports for that. It might very well be the case that Mike Ybarra was also a huge fan of Battle.net, or somebody like him, and maybe these people, now that they've been laid off, that just clears the way for these games to get remasters, get the love they deserve. I mean, there's clearly at least one whole generation of fans who could have been fans of Blizzard games, old Blizzard games, and just haven't been given the opportunity to play the old Blizzard games. There's probably some truth to that for Activision also. There's probably a decent number of old Activision games. In particular, I imagine there's some Call of Duties out there, older versions that should get remastered. I could see Microsoft also just in general not needing to make as many sales on the newest Call of Duty, so they could for 1 month remaster and re-release the first Call of Duty, and then wait a couple months and release a new Call of Duty, and stair step it so that you're getting an old and a new Call of Duty game each year. There could be major de-emphases on microtransactions and things like that at Microsoft. Of course, it could also just get way worse. It is also worth pointing out in this GameDeveloper.com that there is this inherent unfairness to the amount of attention that journalism in general, whether it's video game journalism or otherwise, gives to a president and a CEO who is being allowed to at least make it look like he's leaving on his own accord, versus 500 plus other employees at Microsoft who have been laid off without being given any real mention to their names, their skills. Like, even for a fairly pro-worker website like GameDeveloper.com, they don't bother to make an article going, here is the list of all the employees who've been laid off, here's a link to their LinkedIn profile, and here's where you can potentially try and contact them and hire them if they're looking for jobs or things like that. Or at the very least, here's the names of the people, instead of just being lumped into a group of nobodies, when inherently the people that actually make games are those nameless people, and the named president like Mike Ybarra is at best just sitting back and saying yes to other people's ideas. At worst, he's throwing a monkey wrench in the works and stopping other creative people from creating video games. So 500 is not even the right number. So here you have from GameDeveloper.com, Microsoft follows the Activision Blizzard merger with 1,900 layoffs, which is quite a large amount. And then the update here says the ZeniMax Workers Union released a statement on the layoffs and called for more ZeniMax staff to join its ranks. Now, let's talk about unions for just a brief second here. Had all of Activision Blizzard King been unionized, as far as all the associate level employees, that wouldn't stop them pushing out or forcing Mike Ybarra from leaving, because he wouldn't be in the union. And it might inherently cause a hiring freeze to occur instead of actual layoffs. And what would have had to have happened is that then Microsoft would have had to find reasons to lay off 1,900 employees and become just very anti-worker in that. And that is a problem with a lot of union jobs too, is that if people want to get rid of people and there's a union contract on the table, then all of a sudden the management's one and only job is to document reasons why multiple people should be fired for cause instead of just laying them off without cause, which just comes to a lot of managers making up things or creating ridiculous metrics that nobody can stand up to. It would have taken certainly a lot longer had all of Activision Blizzard King been unionized at that point, and it would have been much more obvious that they were trying to hire people, or lay off people, not hire people. But the other thing that certainly could have happened if they were all unionized is that whenever that union contract ended in, let's say, 4 years, just to pick a time, Microsoft would have just played hardball and refused to sign any new union contract and laid off all the union workers at that point, or tried to, although there are small amounts of union protection if you go on strike because of a union contract negotiation going falling apart, and the protections aren't really that good, really. So yeah, the story would have been certainly that Microsoft, once the union contract, if there was a union contract, went away, that all of the employees would go on strike. Their striking power might be fairly diminished if Microsoft was already trying to lay off all of those employees. But there is certainly a mental aspect to that. If the person in charge of Microsoft or Microsoft Gaming Studio knows that it's a union shop and they have a union contract, they don't spend as much mental energy thinking about laying off 1,900 people. You really wouldn't see 1,900 people getting laid off. You would see strikes, you would see people fighting back, people trying to keep their jobs. In fairness, I'm kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here, because I've also cruelly said that these 1,900 people may very well be the 1,900 people that needed to be laid off at ZeniMax and Activision Blizzard. While also I'm saying that if it was unionized, it would have been better. That being said, it is also worth pointing out that GameDeveloper.com tweeted a knee-jerk response saying that no union employee was laid off in these 1,900 layoffs, and then they had to backpedal on that and say that at least one union employee did say that they had been laid off. Now, arguably, maybe that one union employee was accidentally laid off, and maybe he'll fight for his job and get his job back. Not that you want to stay there. Like, if they laid off 1,900 people, there's probably another 1,900 people at Microsoft now that don't want to stay there. Venture capital is certainly drying up, though, so it's not like 1,900 people are just going to go and form a new company. Although I guess it could happen. If all of a sudden Bobby Kotick said, I'm hiring 1,900 of these laid off people and we're starting a new company, that would be weird, but I don't think you can really enforce a non-compete clause on somebody when you're laying them off like that. And so we may just have a new company or 2 or 3 or 4 come about from these employees, and it'll be interesting to see if maybe they thrive in a new organization where they were not likely to thrive at Microsoft. Meanwhile, it is also worth pointing out that Microsoft announces all these layoffs or performs all these layoffs. They didn't really announce it. The day after they became a $1 trillion company in their stock evaluation. Or a couple days after that. So yeah, Microsoft is certainly sitting pretty as a corporation, being very rich and now getting rid of employees, which will only likely increase their share valuation even higher. But I don't know what to really say either. We also need to certainly recognize that 2023 was one of the worst worst years for video games being developed in general. Microsoft was no exception to that. There are also complaints, certainly, as far as people trying to get people to quit by enforcing return to office policies, which as soon as people realized that a lot of jobs could be done from home, they didn't want to return to the office. So there definitely have been businesses that have said either you return to offices or you'll be fired, in the hopes that a percentage of the employees refuse to return to the office so they can fire them. But yeah, a lot of that really does just boil down to the inherent imbalance of power that really shouldn't exist between an employee and an employer relationship, if those relationships should really exist or at all, where corporations and employers have almost all the power and an employee has no power at all in almost every scenario. There has also been talk about how the former president of Nintendo once made a comment about how he didn't think that his workers felt like he didn't feel like his workers would be as creative or effective if they felt like they were going to be fired. That statement, and mentioning that statement, well, it sounds like a good statement, and like the former president of Nintendo was a really generous person, fully ignores the fact that the Constitution and the labor protection laws in Japan are completely different, and you can't really lay off people or fire them. You have to do so much paperwork and just so much justification to fire people that it just doesn't happen. Japan is, in fact, an example of where union work or worker protection, even without unions, has worked particularly well, although it still hasn't really addressed major problems with capitalism overall, in that even if you are protected in your same job, it doesn't mean that your job will be fulfilling or that it will lead to having an overall fulfilling life. It just means you get to drudge along into your 65s and 70-year-old version of yourself, working the exact same job as a salary man. Moving on, Video Games Chronicles says that Epic says Fortnite will return to iOS in the European Union this year via a new Epic Games Store app, but Epic says it will continue to claim Apple is breaking the law, although in fairness, it should probably be determined whether they mean they're breaking EU law or United States law, because the EU has effectively forced Apple to allow sideloading in the EU, but Apple seems to have no intention to allow sideloading in any other country, and I wouldn't be surprised if they straight up geo-lock it so that you couldn't even order an EU phone or go to Europe and buy a Apple phone and then bring it to America and still sideload. We'll see how much they try to fight sideloading, as it were. The right move would be for the rest of the world to follow the EU's standards and force Apple to sideload too. I imagine the number of people that actually will sideload to an Apple phone would still be incredibly small, but just having the option is a nice thing. And I imagine that there actually won't be that large of a number of people going back to playing Fortnite on iOS. I imagine Fortnite fans have moved on to some other device, PC or otherwise, where they're playing Fortnite and have just gotten used to those new platforms. And I don't suspect Fortnite's going to build a whole new generation of an audience on iOS, Apple devices. The Destroy All Humans developer Black Forest Games has reportedly cut 50% of its staff, known for remaking the Destroy All Human games, so arguably not even the company that made the original games. Black Forest is reportedly the next studio to be hit hard by a wave of layoffs. This is from GameDeveloper.com again. Again, the human relatable thing to say is, well, that's sad, but it's really not that sad. That the one of the Destroy All Humans games was received well. The second remake, or maybe it was even a side multiplayer game that they released, was received particularly poorly. Yes, this is all Embracer Group's fault for trying to become this mega corporation, which, take note that none of these companies that have gotten all these mergers to go through has done anything with it so far. They haven't proven that the concept of a mega corporation for video games works at all. All they've proven is that they can merge and acquire a bunch of intellectual property that they, in Embracer Group's example in particular, sit on and do nothing with, which inevitably something goes wrong and then you're just laying off a bunch of staff. More than likely, if things continue to go wrong at Embracer Group in particular, they're not going to really have any more staff to lay off. They're going to have to liquidate companies and sell off the IP, sell off buildings, sell off furniture and computers. And what's the point of sitting on IP to potentially just be a patent troll for video games? You're not going to get any money from that. Embracer Group trying way too fast and way too hard to be a giant company when they really should have just been THQ Nordic and focused on making a few more good games, maybe merging with just one company to make a few more games. It still feels like Embracer Group has acquired somewhere around 3 to 5 companies that have not returned or released a single video game, and that's just way too many. The former Bungie General Counsel says that the game industry must unionize. Don McGowan was the chief legal officer who pursued Destiny 2 cheaters and players that threatened his co-workers, and he wants the developers to fight for the rights. Yeah, increasingly, particularly if you're getting articles from GameDeveloper.com, there's more people willing to go on record to be pro-union. I still question which union that's going to be. I still question how effective that's going to be. At some level, it could be helpful. Like, I wanted to be a video game programmer when I was a kid. It didn't happen. But if there was unionization there, I potentially would have struggled maybe a little bit more to break into the industry, but I probably would have stayed in the industry forever. The problem, though, is while layoffs may get people talking about unionization, they still are focusing on the wrong things, really. The pay is very high, relatively speaking, for video game developers, to the point where they really are going to have to consider negotiating less raises or even pay cuts in favor of fewer hours and more worker protection overall, just to not be fired. Not being fired is the default thing any union has to negotiate in a contract, because everything else doesn't matter if you get fired. But the real things that need to be addressed as far as unionization in video games are not the things that are being talked about, which is fewer hours, and I don't want to sound like an SJW here, but more diversity. It's practically impossible to not admit that there's a heavy white male presence in the video game industry, and that has created a boys club. It has created cronyism, and it has created a lack of diversity even in the end products as far as video games go. And yes, there is definitely room for creating an environment where minorities, females, and black people, Asians, it's shocking how few Asians really are in video game development, considering how many Asians are in just programming. Yeah, Indians from India would call themselves Asians, but it's worth pointing out just how few even Indians from India are in the game industry and represented. And it needs to be real representation. There is certainly also a incredibly lack of diversity of opinions and thoughts as far as just political leanings. Probably would be true as far as just general personal beliefs, religion, things like that. I would suspect there's a lot of the same groupthink happening in the game industry, and that is something that unionization may very well need to tackle too in the game industry. There is a huge lack of diversity as far as where you are hiring from in the game industry and where you're building offices and building buildings. It doesn't help when there are literally only 3 states out of 50 in the United States to live in, and in those 3 states there is probably only about 5 cities that you would have to live in to be a proper video game developer. Those 5 cities being Richmond, Washington, possibly Los Angeles, California, maybe Hollywood, California, Dallas, Texas, and Austin, Texas. I don't think there's really any game development happening in like Manhattan. I don't think there's really a lot of game development happening in Orlando as far as big cities in the United States otherwise. And as far as other game development cities in North America, maybe there's one video game company in like Mexico City, and then there's probably 3 or 4 studios in Canada, Quebec, Vancouver. But yeah, it certainly doesn't help if you live in Idaho, if you live in Michigan, if you live in even Las Vegas. It doesn't help if you want to be a game developer there and you're a kid in high school learning the program, and then as soon as you graduate from high school you need to move to a fairly unfamiliar and expensive city like Richmond, Washington, or LA, or Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas. Like having to just move to potentially go to a college like Digipen in Richmond, Washington, to just be in that social circle and have a chance of being discovered is crazy. It's as crazy as having to go to Hollywood to try to be an actor, and it creates a bad situation like Hollywood, where there's a lot of people that want to be actors living in Hollywood that can't afford to live in Hollywood and never get a break. Now the good thing about that is that independent game development is on the rise, but we still haven't seen anything, whether unions would help this or not. We haven't seen a case where a lot of independent game developers have then proved themselves as being capable of making video games and then getting hired to work at a AA or AAA game studio. But yeah, overall, I think pretty much everybody in the United States in every industry should unionize at this point. I have yet to hear of an industry where the jobs are great and unionization is just not needed. There probably are a few businesses out there that is the case, but industry-wide it tends not to be the case. Even if one restaurant treats its waiter staff great, the next restaurant down the street will undercut that one restaurant by paying their employees less and treating their employees worse. And eventually the good restaurant that pays well and treats their staff well is going to struggle to compete, because exploitation always wins in capitalism, because it makes more money, and making more money at all costs is the way to win in capitalism. Let's see. The Outrider Studio, People Can Fly, which is funny to refer to them as the Outrider Studio, is laying off the Project Gemini developers. To those individuals transitioning out of the studio due to these changes, we extend our sincere appreciation for the skills and expertise you brought to the team. At least in this GameDeveloper.com story, which they're all layoff stories now. There's been more layoffs in this 1 month than I think happened throughout all of 2023. But at least here they're paying some lip service and being nice in the laying off of people. And you certainly can do that when you're laying off people. It's not like you're firing them for cause. So you don't have to really be silent or hostile about it. Let's see. Apple is going to allow game streaming services on its App Store, which I again would suspect this is because the EU is forcing them to do that, to allow side loading. Although game streaming services are different than side loading, and perhaps it's an argument that Apple is making to say, well, if they're streaming something to the iPhone, it's less likely to have a virus or something in it that would break or steal data from iPhone users. Let's see. Blizzard's president and chief design officer are leaving, and its survival game has been cancelled. This is from Video Games Chronicles. Microsoft will name a new leader for the World of Warcraft studio next week, which feels to me like if they didn't have a character already lined up to replace him, it maybe was a bit of a surprise that Mike Ybarra and Alan Adham are leaving the studio. And in this story, it definitely seems like these two might go on to work somewhere else. Meanwhile, I had no idea that they were working on a survival game, and it must have not been going very well. I did hear a story that one of the games that was being developed that got cancelled was being hamstrung by using an internal engine that just wasn't the right engine to use, instead of just using the Unreal Engine, which it seemed like the developers really wanted to use and prototype everything in the Unreal Engine. But the Unreal Engine couldn't handle 100-player co-op, and that seemed to be a order from on high that they wanted 100-player co-op, which in modern times, even making a desire for 100-player co-ops is just completely disconnected from reality. Most games, even if they are co-op games, struggle to have 4 players playing co-op, let alone 100. Even Palworld, which is doing amazingly well, is not going to consistently have 100 people co-oping and playing together. They may have 32 to 100 people on the server at the same time, but they're going to be in way different directions doing different things. We are far, far past the point in which you could have 100 players in a World of Warcraft style game playing against each other, or that you should even be targeting those large of numbers. Personally, as somebody who never had any real interest in World of Warcraft, I think I would experience the World of Warcraft better, or just about the same, if I was the only character in the game, or if there was maybe a small group of, say, 10 player characters or 1 player character and 9 NPCs. Here we have Video Games Chronicle covering the 1900 staff. Now they say it's across Xbox, Bethesda, and Activision Blizzard. I've only really heard Bethesda, and it really not even being Bethesda, but ZeniMax and Activision Blizzard King. I haven't heard any other layoffs happening, but yeah, it could be happening. Phil Spencer says the staff tells the staff he's made a quote painful decision. Yeah, and inherently this has to fall on Phil Spencer. It feels like Major Nelson, when he was in charge, was not willing to do as many layoffs in his tenure, and as soon as Phil Spencer gets that Activision Blizzard merger done, he very quickly does some layoffs. But again, talking on both sides of my mouth here, I kind of agree with Phil Spencer. There probably should have been way more layoffs, and frankly, during the time Major Nelson was in charge, had there been a layoff of 200, 300 people 1 month, 1 quarter, then another 200, 300 people the next quarter, it wouldn't sound as big of a deal, even if for a full year, every quarter you were laying off another 300 staff. Particularly if you're not doing a hiring freeze at the same time, you could lay off 300 people, and then you could hire another 100 people and find that that new 100 people actually work very well. Then you could lay off another 300 people and just kind of cycle out the bad in the hopes of getting some good new staff. Now, if Microsoft started hiring for employees, it does just feel like there will be legacy employees that hate the new employees, and it will always be us versus them instead of trying to integrate the new employees with the old employees, which maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want to get rid of the old employees and just have a whole new staff come in and take over. Depends what Phil Spencer really wants to have happen. Or, very possibly, Phil Spencer really just recognized that they didn't need these positions to exist at all and is fully just downsizing to something much more manageable. Let's see. Moving on, Video Games Chronicle says a PS5 update has seemingly targeted the Cronus Zen device that can be used for cheating. The controller adapter and modding tool can be used to give a player an unfair advantage, is what they're saying. I've never heard of this device, so I have no idea if it's true or not at some level. It seems like only a certain amount of cheating can happen with any intermediate device, and it may very well not be recognizable by a console. Apparently this update is not mandatory, so you can just skip it at the time. But yeah, I have no idea what the Cronus Zen application really device does, so I'd have to get into the weeds, and they're not really explaining well as far as what the device actually does, so that you could decide for yourself whether it's a device that allows cheating by your own personal definition of cheating. This is a great example of Video Games Chronicle being a bad journalist, in that they are telling you what is the truth without giving you facts, stating something as facts without giving you supporting information. I guess that's a better way to say that. Because like you're stating an opinion here. Unfair advantage. When you say unfair, that's an opinion. Advantage, arguably, it might even be an opinion. So give me some facts to determine what this device does, or at least let me click on a link talking about the Cronus Zen. I'm frankly a little surprised that there isn't just a ad that's being blocked. There might be an ad that's being blocked as far as where you would purchase this device. It looks to me like it's a USB plugs on the front, and then maybe some cords that come out the back, and then a little OLED screen. But I mean, I could do just about anything. Moving on, Video Games Chronicle says F-Zero 99's latest update adds secret tracks and private lobbies. The maximum level and skill rating for players has also been increased amongst other features, which this is all good and well, except for the fact that this is on the background of Nintendo shutting down all online support for the 3DS and the Wii U, and the history of the 2 previous 99 games that Nintendo has released being games that have been shut down. So I guess enjoy F-Zero 99 while it still exists, but also plan for them to abandon it in a year or two at most. A poker-inspired roguelike deck builder called Balatro is launching February 20th for all consoles and PCs, which in comparison, that is not really big news. So I probably opened this tab earlier before all the layoffs happened. Blizzard had canceled this Odyssey MMO, and this is GameDeveloper.com just using the same story with a different headline. Apparently this Odyssey MMO was first mentioned in 2022, which in all fairness, if you told me that Blizzard was making yet another MMO, I would say stop that, don't do that. I would not be happy around that idea, because I don't see the good Blizzard in my nostalgia as the makers of World of Warcraft. I see World of Warcraft being the turning point in which they made far too much money from World of Warcraft and started to abandon all of their very well written, very well designed single player games. Here's the quote from GameDeveloper.com, so we can get the full quote here. Layoffs are not the solution. Nintendo doesn't want it. So they're trying to imply that this is direct quote without using quotation marks, when the actual direct quote here is, I sincerely doubt employees who fear that they may be laid off will be able to develop software titles that could impress people, end quote. And even in this quote, I would have to question whether he didn't say that in Japanese, which, if somebody's speaking a different language, you probably shouldn't use quotation marks. Or at the very least, you do quotation marks and then you would put parentheses translated from Japanese, unless he was speaking English. Here we have more quotes. But again, it's just ridiculously being a revisionist historian and not recognizing the reality of the situation, to not realize that Nintendo, particularly of Nintendo of Japan, has to follow a completely different system as far as worker protections, and couldn't lay off people even if they wanted to. Inherently, we need to be way more serious about these kinds of things and realize that Nintendo has effectively maintained a very low number of employees for decades, and they do that by not hiring new people, and they do that by not crediting a significant number of second-party developers and third-party developers who make games with Nintendo's branding. I think very little of what is a Nintendo game is 100% made in-house at Nintendo. They have second-party developers that they are using, and sometimes they give them credits for real, but normally people just assume a Nintendo game is being 100% made by Nintendo, and it just isn't the case. It is also worth pointing out third-party deals where a lot of third-party games are being licensed out to non-Japanese companies, and then once you have a non-Japanese third-party developer hiring games, then there's still very much those cycles of hiring somebody to work for one game, and as soon as that one game is released and published, laying off a significant number of the QA testers, if not laying off a significant number of the other creatives, the programmers, the artists, the writers. A lot of times writers are hired on short-term contracts anyway, so they're not even fully employed by third-party developers of games. So it really is just being naive, intentionally naive, to say Nintendo is the good guy and that Nintendo is above these systems that have been designed to exploit workers as much as possible. And the exploitation in Japan, even with worker protection, is still massively high. You're not talking at all about the forced drinking with your boss that is just socially required, the forced agreeing with your boss and kowtowing to your boss, which is socially required, the sleeping on the job that is socially encouraged, the forced major amounts of hours. It's not like Japanese employees, even working at Nintendo, are going home to mansions. A lot of them are going to tiny little apartments, sometimes without even bathrooms attached directly to those apartments as salarymen. A lot of times, jobs in Tokyo, even though Nintendo isn't in Tokyo, you're spending every dollar basically that comes in, because you don't have a kitchen, you don't really, or you may have a tiny kitchen, but you're mostly going to be forced socially or just economically to eat out. So yeah, nobody is getting rich even with the worker protections in Japan. There's no upward mobility. There perhaps is a slightly more upward mobility in Japan than a lot of places in the United States, but it's not like they have a perfect system, and there may not be a perfect system, but we at least need to be honest and not sing the praises of somebody who's effectively just saying something knowing he'll get away with it, perhaps trying to get credit and pat himself on the back for doing something that he had no choice really in. Moving on, Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition is going to hit PC in March. The new trailer also shows off features included in the PC version of the sequel, which, okay, I guess check out this Video Games Chronicle article if you're interested. We're still in a very weird situation, though, with the Horizon series, in that Forbidden West being the sequel is just not anywhere as well received as the original Horizon game was, and I assume the Complete Edition includes the DLC, which was also not received particularly well for the sequel. It more than likely is a series that should be, in retrospective, just played as a single game. Play that first game and then don't play the sequel. And Sony kind of has a history of that during that time frame, where Last of Us 1, probably better if you just play the first Last of Us and then pretend like the second one doesn't exist. And more, that may just be the way to play certain game series, is play the good ones. Video Games Chronicle says the Callisto Protocol studio Striking Distance is working on a brand new unannounced Unreal Engine 5 title. The studio's CEO Glenn Schofield left after the first game misfired. Inherently, Striking Distance has to kind of announce something or they have to shut down completely. So it does make some sense to announce something, and announcing an engine is not really announcing that much. And they're not even saying really what genre it will be in. Meanwhile, it is also worth pointing out that, unless I'm recalling incorrectly, there is new accusations against Striking Distance studio or somebody at Striking Distance studio of sexual harassment and unlawful termination, and we'll get to that story too. So yeah, Striking Distance Studio is not in a good position. Their first game flopped, and there's just going to be a struggle now. In fact, it really is more of a case where you should just shut down your company. If your first game does not hit well, just shut down your company. At the very least, change the name. If it's a mediocre success, you don't do that, but if there's more negativity than positively associated with a company like Striking Distance, just change the name of your company, shut it down, start a new company. Inherently, in any other business, you would probably do something like that, go bankrupt and alleviate yourself of any debts you might have accrued in the process of developing a game. Although the publishing system, in which publishers pay for a lot of things, maybe makes it less necessary for video game companies to do that, but maybe that is in part of the problem with the publishing system overall. We already talked about Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition coming to PC on March 21st, and I guess I definitely will just put it on the follow list. Here we have Video Games Chronicle saying over 5,000 game industry workers have already lost their jobs in 2024. The number of game industry across in January is already more than half the total jobs that were lost in the entirety of 2023. So we aren't already past the whole amount of 2023. Like I said before, I was wrong, but we are halfway there, which is still ridiculous. And not a lot of reasons to expect too much to change. Apparently, Universal Studio pulled videos showing the Zelda producer at a construction site. This is from Video Games Chronicle. The upcoming theme park in Orlando will include Super Nintendo World. I mean, that doesn't really mean much though. Like, the Zelda producer could just be there offering feedback, and there may not be any Zelda elements. One thing I did hear is that the Japanese Nintendo World is designed for shorter, thinner Japanese people, to the point where foreigners, people from the United States in particular, who are fatter and taller, were not being allowed on certain rides because of the safety requirements. So, yeah, with that extra bit of information, it just makes it even more obvious that you shouldn't bother to go to Japan to see that Nintendo World, when we know there is going to be a Super Nintendo World in Orlando that almost certainly will be bigger and better than the small square footage that they had to work within in Japan, and it will be in English. With everything being Mario Brothers themed in Japan, I wouldn't inherently expect to see a Zelda thing, and I don't know what you really could do as far as Zelda themes overall. You could certainly have like one ride, but I think the vast majority of it should look like the Mushroom Kingdom. And then if they're going to have a spin-off section, like the Donkey Kong section that was added, or the Donkey Kong Country section that was added to the Japanese Nintendo World, that should be its own separate thing. But if you were going to have your own separate thing for Zelda, I don't know what you really could do with it. There just aren't that many interesting enemies and characters in the modern Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom characters. It's kind of the same bad guys over and over again, and a bunch of temples, none of which are that interesting. And I'm not even sure that there's a uniquely interesting looking castle in Breath of the Wild. And it would be very weird to make like a Zelda section and then have like a Wind Waker art style characters in one side, and then an Ocarina of Time style of characters on one side, and a Breath of the Wild style of Zelda characters on another side. But yeah, I would be interested certainly to see what they could creatively make. But clearly they want to keep everything secret until they're ready to announce things. And when they do announce things, it will still just be a theme park in a world that is pretty much far past the point of theme parks. Kids these days the parents can't afford to take their kids to Disney World, and Disney World has become considerably worse than what it was decades previously, with just super long lines and not really adding and improving on a lot of the rides. It's just not worth it to go to Disney World or Disneyland in most cases, and kids were more interested in like the Star Wars sections and the Harry Potter sections at Disney World anyways. I wouldn't be surprised if Mario World also is going to be only interesting to kids that are very, very young, like 6, 7, 8-year-olds, not 10, 11, 12-year-olds even. And nostalgic parents will probably be least satisfied going to a Nintendo World. Yep. Here we can show Larry Herb here commenting directly, not really holding his tongue. Another sad day in the gaming industry, frowning face, retweeting someone else. That cut affects around 8% of the Microsoft's gaming division. Full details below at The Verge. Which, yeah, on the face of it, assuming Larry Herb here, formerly known as Major Nelson, the guy previously in charge, is coming off as kind of a good guy, but inherently he very well may be the bad guy. Had he laid off a few more people every now and then, you wouldn't have built up to a major 8% of Microsoft needing to be laid off. Particularly, you can't really blame Larry Herb for the Activision Blizzard layoffs, but you definitely could blame him for not laying off ZeniMax employees, which should have happened probably 2 or 3 years ago, and just general Microsoft gaming employees who are just not really delivering. Even now they're not delivering. And as gamers we are really more interested in what games are being developed, and we really can't care too much as a gamer if a bunch of people get laid off or a bunch of people don't get laid off. We just want games to be good and games to be made. We're just consumers. We don't care how the sausage is made. Maybe we should care, and gamers are kind of good about caring, but until the entirety of the United States gaming community in particular could get together and say we believe in something like universal basic income, or having employment for life, or even pro-unionization, we really can't care that much. We definitely aren't to the point where we would boycott Microsoft for laying off 1,900 employees, or even really have a significant negative feeling towards Microsoft because they laid off 1,900 employees. Some people will probably be upset for a week or two, and then they'll just find something else to be upset about. Let's see, GameDeveloper.com has an update here saying Palworld has topped 8 million sales on Steam alone. Which, yeah, the numbers are big. Although notably, I've only seen a couple of YouTubers that I follow actually try and play Palworld, and so far it looks fine as a game, but I haven't seen anything in major detail as far as what it is or how it plays. Here we have potentially let's just click our translation plugin and see what this says. This is probably here we have the Pokemon company going, regarding inquiries regarding other companies' games, We've received numerous inquiries from customers regarding the games released in January of 2024 by other companies, stating that it is similar to Pokemon and asking us to confirm whether the game is licensed by our company. Our company does not permit any use of Pokemon. Interesting, it's not stylized with the accent here in the game. Interesting, in this game. They're not naming the game, but they're talking about a specific game. It's also interesting they're not going with like a trademark or copyright. Furthermore, we will investigate any acts of infringement of intellectual property rights related to Pokemon. It does look like there's an accent on this one. Let's see. Pokemon here. Pokemon with an accent here. Interesting how the translation from Japanese is different. And take appropriate action. Our company will continue to bring out the individuality of each Pokemon, protect and nurture its world with care, and work to connect the world with Pokemon, again with the accent. Pokemon Company Limited. And I imagine this is the English version where I didn't need to translate it. I don't know if I just scroll down lower. So yeah, that's their response. Which, until we see this actually go to court, if it does go to court at all, we're going to see a precedent made one way or another, either in Japanese law in particular, or somehow in United States law. The general idea of a fictional character is owned by the Pokemon Company in a lot of cases, or generic characters with different names that have some physical similarities cannot be copyrighted. If they could get deeper into saying that somehow Palworld is directly stealing 3D models from Pokemon games, maybe there's a copyright infringement case that could be made there, but if that's not happening, then I think parody law protects Palworld in the United States at the very least. The fact that Palworld is somewhat sarcastic also protects them. It is also worth pointing out that there is already some precedent in the fact that the people for the ethical treatment of animals, who often go too far and are fairly ridiculous, have made at least a couple of Pokemon parody games or ad campaigns that have parody Pokemon being butchered and eaten and in other ways abused. So yeah, this has already been done. It's also worth mentioning as far as copyright, Steamboat Willie being public domain. So far, Disney has not made any big movements to sue anybody for using Mickey Mouse in a way they don't appreciate, as far as the original version of Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie. Some elements of Mickey Mouse that were added later may be copyrighted still, but at a certain argument, if the original Steamboat Willie short film said Mickey Mouse and Steamboat Willie, and then they depict Mickey Mouse as you see him there with a mouse with gloves and shoes and a hat, the name Mickey Mouse probably should be public domain then, and the depiction of how Mickey Mouse looks there should probably be public domain. And I would argue derivative works, future versions of Mickey Mouse, probably should also be public domain, because if the base core thing that could be copyrighted becomes public domain, but derivative works don't become public domain, then all you would have to do is just make a slight change to the original public domain Mickey Mouse to constantly have claims of copyright And I don't think that the Library of Congress and the United States laws want to really appreciate that. So it may very well be the case, it would have to be argued in court, that every single variation of Mickey Mouse is in the public domain too, as far as derivative works go. It may also be the case that the depiction of Mickey Mouse was just never copyrightable in general, and only the name of Mickey Mouse was copyrightable in the first place, which might be the case because, you know, an anthropomorphic mouse creature is not really that unique, regardless of how you consistently draw Mickey Mouse. Let's see. Moving on, Owlcat Games veterans have launched a program for a newly started Europe and Mina developers. Narwhal Accelerator angles to help newly opened studios in Latin America and Mina find partnerships and publish deals for their projects. What does Mina stand for? Middle East Nations? Yeah, I have no idea what Mina even stands for, so this is a great example of GameDeveloper.com just not having a way to hover over a word to find a definition. Maybe I'm just an ignorant United Statesian for not knowing what Mina stands for, but it would be helpful. So basically, we're seeing a few instances of this where people are trying to fund development in cheap countries and act as publishers and potentially get profits in cheap developing countries, acting as potentially even more exploitive publishers than your average employee, your average publisher goes, by targeting Latin America people and Mina people. Let's see, here's where GameDeveloper.com put their update. A former Blizzard Entertainment VFX artist has informed Game Developer that they were laid off by Microsoft despite being a CW member, perhaps indicating that some unionized devs were impacted by the cuts. Notice how they're phrasing this, perhaps indicating that some unionized devs were impacted by the cuts. You don't have to have any of this here. Like, the update here clearly should be a former Blizzard VFX artist has informed Game Developer they were laid off by Microsoft despite being a CW member. Period. That's the end of the story. You are trying to backpedal and make it sound like there's some possibility that you are correct in your unresearched, untested statement here that Microsoft and Activision Blizzard layoffs didn't impact a single CW union members. And arguably, and obviously this is a case of just Game Developer being so pro-union and putting out so high amounts of pro-union propaganda that they've gone past the point of being believable and realistic. Like, perhaps indicating that some unionized devs, like, maybe you could have said obviously some unionized devs were impacted. Note here too, there's no apology for being wrong. No apology or admittance really that you're wrong. And that's just a terrible attitude for a self-claimed news reporting site to die on being wrong and prove yourself to being wrong. And I'm being fairly generous about it, but certainly there are going to be anti-union, more right-wing people that are going to dive on this fact and just have entire videos where Game Developer is destroyed once again for their inaccuracies or for their pro-union propaganda nonsense. You just don't make this kind of statement. You don't make any statement as a news reporter unless you can back it up. You could ask the question, certainly, but you can't make a definitive statement when you don't have evidence. You could have certainly said it didn't seem to impact union members, but also seeming may just be a case of you didn't research it, which clearly they didn't research it. Here we have GameDeveloper.com talking about how Odyssey's MMO was killed due to ongoing engine woes. The technical issues within the Odyssey's engine forced Blizzard to cancel the MMO despite it getting positive internal reception. Which, yeah. At a certain level, again, I'll repeat myself and say I don't want an MMO, but also, why would Microsoft continue with a project for a new game when there's plenty of old games to be remastered and re-released? As far as MMOs going, there's at the very least more classic servers for World of Warcraft to be dealt with. And yes, Microsoft can't just continuously re-release old games and never make anything new, but yeah, I think most Blizzard fans would prefer Overwatch 1 to still be supported instead of them making Overwatch 2. I think most people would have preferred a Diablo 2 expansion years later instead of Diablo 3 with its online marketplace nonsense. So, yeah. Definitely feels like Blizzard in particular should just focus on things that are working and not over ambitiously try to make an MMO that won't work. There is also, pretty obviously, just looking at the screenshot, some Skyrim fantasy vibes. So if you're going to make an MMO with a fantasy vibe, that just doesn't make sense for Microsoft because they already have the Elder Scrolls Online. So either you shut down Odyssey and move all of the staff from Odyssey to Elder Scrolls Online if you need to move them, or you lay them off. But you would be competing against yourself unless Odyssey just plays really different from Elder Scrolls Online and somehow is better than Elder Scrolls Online, which has a low chance of doing that. Here we have the story I was talking about before. A former Crafton employee is suing the company in a sexual assault and wrongful termination case. I was confused here. I don't know why they are using this screenshot from Striking Distance Studios and Callisto Protocol when Crafton is the PUBG publisher. Yeah, so I was confused just by bad GameDeveloper.com screenshot choices. The PUBG publisher reportedly failed to investigate an alleged assault and terminated the victim months after reporting it. Well, that seems like a pretty open and shut case of doing the wrong things, if that's really how it went. Although, in fairness, it is not a terrible idea if you see writing on the wall that you're going to be fired to make some kind of complaint. Perhaps it's unethical and immoral to make a sexual assault claim, but I wouldn't put it past people to do that if they know they're going to be fired in a way of keeping them employed. And maybe it did work to keep that person employed when they would have been terminated even earlier for poor performance or some other reason. And at a certain level, I mean, I can't really even blame people that make exaggerated claims or false claims, because, I mean, whatever helps an individual get any kind of money and improve their lot in life is basically acceptable on some levels to me, because life is just so hard. Like, and the capitalism makes it so difficult to even survive, let alone thrive, that scams and schemes and manipulation just have to be on the table. You can't play by the books and play morally and respectfully when every single corporation you're going to work for is going to exploit you and not play morally and respectfully. How can you? It's the old argument as far as how can you argue about or even care about somebody stealing $1 or $2 from the tip jar at a business when the business themselves are stealing thousands of dollars in hours in wage theft. Like, that's just balancing things out. Sure, it'd be nice if it was a fair, safe playfield role involved and that you had a chance, but you just don't in a lot of cases. Anyways, let's get away from speculation and instead see what facts we can pull from this. In the suit filed in December of 2023, the plaintiff claims that she was assaulted by the then global marketing VP Kevin Kimball. Is it fair to not name the plaintiff and then name the accused? I think if you're going to name somebody or even describe their position, it's only fair enough to name the plaintiff. The alleged incident took place at a work party at the 2022 Game Awards, which I'm sure Jeff Keighley loves to be involved in this story. I'm being sarcastic, of course. This inherently, I think, also highlights the problem with having award shows and having work parties at all. It makes a lot of sense to just say everybody's going to work 9 to 5, then get out. No work parties, no after hours get-togethers, no drinking, no alcohol. We want you as far away from each other once you clock out as possible, so we don't have these kinds of encounters. Best case scenario is you'll end up with inter-office romances. Worst case scenario, you end up with sexual assault charges. There, Kimball made alleged advances to her while trying to get her more alcohol. The suit then claims he forced himself on her in a bathroom stall until she escaped crying, which the first sentence here sounds like he was just hitting on somebody, which arguably still not acceptable with an imbalance of power being there, but second sentence here, forced himself on her, could have been forcing a kiss, which was unwelcome, could be anything at all, and who knows. Party was for Striking Distance Studios, which launched its debut Callisto Protocol, which, yeah, but if it's not a employee at Striking Distance Studios but Crafton, it's really unfair to use Callisto Protocol as your screenshot here. Clearly, this is a important story to report on, so perhaps not just having a video game Space Marine character as your screenshot in the first place would be the right move. Maybe just not have a screenshot in this case. And so far from what I've read, I don't think we need trigger warnings either. After reporting the incident to Crafton, the plaintiff claims that she was ignored and eventually fired in February of 2023. Prior to that, they failed to investigate and let exist a hostile, oppressive, dangerous, and violent work environment. And instead of protecting the plaintiff and all females from such sex harassment, the suit says nothing was done to address Kimball's sex assault. In addition to wrongful termination, the plaintiff is suing Kimball for emotional distress. She claims he created a hostile work environment in retaliation against her complaint to the Crafton leadership. At the time of the reading, neither Kimball or Crafton responded to Polygon. Game developer has reached out to the latter and will update this story when a response is given. Interesting, game developer here is saying they have reached out to Polygon, but not reached out to, or maybe they mean Crafton. here, but they're not. Uh, they're not reaching out to Kimball, the accused, just the company, and they are bending over backwards to not mention the plaintiff, which, yes, harassment does exist online too, but just because harassment exists and it's happened in the past, in the past, does not allow one side to be unnamed. So if I click on this full lawsuit, let's see if you've got like full phone numbers and emails here for the law offices. Let's see. The plaintiff is A. Goertz is the name. Goertz. I think that is more than fair that the name should be out there and mentioned in general. And she is suing several subsidiaries of Crafton and PUBG, but noticeably not suing Kimball directly, as far as I can see, and not suing, Kevin Kimball is mentioned here, but not suing Striking Distance. Oh, then no, she is suing Striking Distance Studios. And that's pretty typical too, is that you're going to just name every party that might even slightly be involved, and then half of these parties will probably say we weren't involved. I'm a little surprised that she's not suing the Game Awards too, but if the Game Awards, say, provided the alcohol for the party or something, or provided the room. But yeah. A. Goertz. The name needs to be out there if you're going to name Kimball. If you were going to keep it private, or if game developer was going to keep it private and not mention either name, then that would be game developer's choice. But as a matter of public record, the lawsuit is available to be seen. Obviously, I just clicked on it. At least the initial filing is. And there was no effort to obfuscate the name, really, in that case. Unless, of course, that's an alias, which I don't think you're allowed to use aliases on legal proceedings without mentioning it, at least. But yeah. It's biased, to say the least, to mention the accused's name, Kimball, and not mention the plaintiff's name, Goertz. And by mentioning the names, if you are going to mention the names, you might get some other people out there that are willing to either collaborate one side or the other, or at least add some insight overall. Sadly, these kinds of incidences either end in settlement or they just go on forever and you never hear about them ending. And obviously, the accusations are going to be very one-sided and written in a one-sided way, and the proof has to be proven in a court of law as far as whether any of it really happened or if it happened the way it's being described. But yeah, let's move on. This still is going to be a really long stream, even though I've tried to make it shorter. And that may just be a case of there being a lot of news now. We're back into having news. GameDeveloper.com has this article saying that a new Love Live game is going to be released in February and then shut down in May. Which maybe there's an intentional reason for that. but mostly I would assume that they had some kind of contractual obligation to to release it in the West, and the Japanese version is shutting down on March 31st. So it seems like they're just fulfilling technically the contractual obligation without actually even giving it a chance to succeed, because the Japanese one seems to have already failed. And this is kind of the problem with like mobile games, and this I think is a mobile game. If it's not a mobile game, it definitely feels like a mobile game. It is also probably true that Love Live is just not that popular anymore, so it would make sense to not support something that isn't very popular and isn't likely to become popular again. The Godot engine, and perhaps I'm talking too much about the Godot engine. Let's see. There's somebody looking for help as far as making a Steam game. But in Godot Engine 4, they're trying to bring back or increase support for programming in C# with .NET. Now, as far as I understand it, C# and .NET are pretty much going to be Windows supported, and so they have a point here to point this out, that if you're going to use a runtime such as Core CLR, Mono, or native AOT, you're going to need these versions of .NET for that to work. Whereas if you're using the runtime Mono for Android, you're going to need a 7.0, and for iOS you're going to need native AOT for 8.0. Now Web, I don't think uses .NET at all. So that does imply to me that .NET actually does allow you to port, particularly over native AOT, to Mac and Linux, where for the most part I would expect anything with .NET integrated at all would not just work at all, because .NET's made by Microsoft and made for Microsoft programming. It does certainly imply in this that you could stick to C# programming for Android and iOS, whereas historically programming in more of a Java would be what you would have done for Android, and I think it's somewhat like Java for iOS. And you might be closer to C++ instead of C# for Linux. But yeah, it seems like there's more support there than not. Although, I'm not 100% sure what .NET really gets you for what it's worth. And I would lean towards saying, unless I understood what adding .NET to your game helps, you probably should just avoid adding libraries and middle softwares and APIs in the same way that you would rather use something like OpenGL that's an open API than DirectX, but OpenGL very possibly doesn't work as well as DirectX, so it might be better to use DirectX. Censored Gaming put out another video getting to the heart of it, talking about I think it's Japan Times article that interviewed people in Japan, game developers in Japan, talking about how they are more and more working with Western localizers to censor more things, having Western companies read over their dialogues and their story to just make sure nothing is offensive at all, and that has led to more censorship and only encouraged Sony to have more censorship on the PlayStation in particular. They talk specifically as far as elements in Like a Dragon in the first game just not being acceptable according to the Western localizers in the Western world, and in general it is described as angering the Japanese game developers, which, yeah, I don't think they're happy about it. I don't think anybody's happy about being censored in any way. Censored Gaming also made an article showing how Neptunia Sisters vs. Sisters is censored in the way it was before, for mostly just dialogue and cuss words, I think is mostly what it was, for the Switch and the Xbox One in the series. Alright, now I'm gonna pause the recording and take a break before we start going through the rest of the news. So I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So that let us do the Duel live at least while we're doing that. Yep. Another 5 gems. Wow. Amazing. 5 gems for watching a Duel live. It's gotten so pathetic. Like, if you're only going to give me 5 gems, you might as well just let me watch as many Duel lives as I want to in a day, maybe up to 200 gems, and just watch it nonstop. And it did occur to me, I noticed we have Alice on the chat saying hello. Hello, Alice. At some point, maybe around Christmas, I should just do a subscribe-a-thon, a watch time-a-thon. Like, I could do it probably way earlier than Christmas, where I am just straight up having Duel live plays. It's not very good content, certainly, and it's not indicative content of what I want to make or what I make otherwise. But yeah, certainly seems like even watching a Duel live gets people's attention more often than not. Let's go through the games that came out on Wednesday. This is going to be a fairly long stream regardless. So we've got games that we saw that were new, got press releases on Wednesday, and then we've got what is a relatively long list of, is this a VR game? New games that just came out on Steam. It still feels a little weird to break up the big news that we talk about with the games that came out, but it kind of makes some sense too. Here we have a Japanese and Korean and Chinese only visual novel, which looks like it might be a in part puzzle game too. Here you have some Hanafuda cards, but the combination here is not even particularly a high scorer as far as Hanafuda cards go. But yeah, we really can't get too much from it. I mentioned earlier in the stream how Game Grumps really aren't gamers, and that they play games in the hopes of saying something silly, which then occasionally creates a scenario in which they played a game called Wedding Witch that was a Vampire Survivors clone with an anime lady in a lingerie kind of wedding outfit, and then they really seem to like that game, which creates a surprising situation, certainly, where a game like Wedding Witch wouldn't really get any mainstream coverage at all, but then they're getting some kind of coverage from Game Grumps. Whether you consider that mainstream or not, I would say it probably is close enough to being mainstream. Meanwhile, I don't think Game Grumps is going to play Palworld on their channel anytime around its launch time, and I could probably make a list of thousands of games that Game Grumps should have covered and just don't cover. But honestly, I also don't really want them to cover games, because what they do when they quote-unquote cover games is not really giving any informative bit of information or critique. Arguably, it's not even fair use as far as what games they're covering, because they're just using the games more often than not as background to do I want to say yes to this? We'll give it a chance. Yeah, more often than not, they're using the games as background to just try to be funny themselves and be improv comics. I feel like there is another game called Vincent the Vampire, but that looked different than this. I'll give this a chance. Looks like we might be seeing just a slightly higher percentage of low effort joke games and garbage games, which, yeah, as we're moving out of January, these games that are effectively just indie releases seem to increase with what feels like no direct connection or correlation at all to layoffs amongst Microsoft and AAA game developers and publishing companies, which I think that probably highlights that there literally are just two industries, particularly on PC Steam games, as far as there are. And I would argue there's probably closer to 3 or 4 industries, because you also have like super independent itch.io simple games. Then you have Steam Direct games that at least try to look a little bit more polished and or try to have some kind of gimmick that you would actually pay some money for it. This one is already on the follow list, so I'm going to opt not to make another YouTube short around it. Snow Plowing Simulator is mixed review already, so I'm going to say no to it. But yeah, you have a AAA industry, which is the name of EA, Uplay, Ubisoft, and Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo. Those are the AAA publishers in the AAA game industry at a certain level. And then you have Steam games and independent games. And I would argue maybe even a single A should be still in that industry of games directly trying to compete with major games. Here's an interesting game. I saw this just randomly searching Stargate on a Roku TV search, and they were streaming a presentation about this game on some weird Twitch channel or something. That this Stargate Timekeepers has not gotten any like major press, and it really should, considering it's Stargate and it looks like they actually have the license to Stargate. You can't just make a game called Stargate and have a picture of the Stargate that accurately. You might be able to make a game called Stargate, but then you would have to, whatever the Stargate in your game is, would have to be different. It's a real-time tactics stealth game, which is not being received well. So let's take a look. Not super surprised. Inherently, Stargate as a series has been ruined. It was a long-running, long-supported on the Sci-Fi Channel series, but they have massively failed to do anything new with Stargate. At some point, they announced some new Stargate content, and they made like internet shorts, and that was it. It was very disappointing. There's been a lot of talk of rebooting the Stargate movie, which is what one of the major producers wants to do, is just remake the original movie and forget everything about Stargate SG-1 and Stargate Atlantis and all of that, which at some level maybe you could do that, but then if you're rebooting the movie, you're either trying to have a movie series, which won't make a lot of sense, or you're trying to reboot a TV series once again. You do have to effectively get rid of all the actors from the previous Stargate series because they're just all too old anyways. So the only premise you can really live with is the Stargate, and a full-on reboot to get rid of all the aliens and just set it in a different universe also would make a lot of sense too. Like, there's far too much canon in the Stargate SG-1 and its spin-off shows universe for any good that really happened there. And arguably the premise of the original Stargate movie is not that complicated anyways. So yeah, the nostalgia for Stargate does not outweigh the problems with Stargate that it just crushed itself on by having such a long running, moderately successful series. But if Sci-Fi Channel actually was smart, they probably would have a new rebooted Stargate series that wasn't particularly that ambitious. Or you do something like Star Trek Lower Decks. You definitely at least try as well as they've done with Star Trek and just have something called Stargate and continue to work in that direction. It won't be as successful as Star Trek, but you try. You can see on the reviews here, it's like, I really wanted to like this game, but I don't like this game. It's a stealth game. Yeah, there's just a large number of people. Too long didn't read. If you want a difficult stealth game, then it's goodbye. If you want a Stargate game, don't bother. Yep. It kind of runs into the same problems too. It's like, even making a video game around the Stargate universe, which would make it easier because you could have animated models of the characters from the TV series and movies, and they could live forever and won't age in those 3D cartoon models. You still struggle with the concept of what is a Stargate game supposed to look like. If anything, it probably should be something closer to a Telltale game where there's a lot of story and dialogue and talking happen. Yes, there are action sequences in episodes of Stargate SG-1, sure, plenty of them, but they often were fairly simplistic gunfights. Maybe you get an occasional ship fight, but it definitely wasn't the emphasis. There was perhaps a little bit too much military in the Stargate. So if I was going to reboot Stargate, I would definitely try and set it more like in a different direction. I'd probably have the Stargate being found by some kind of eccentric billionaire and being run by his corporation instead of the military. And then if that didn't work, at any point you could have a season finale where the military comes in and takes the Stargate. But just have it be more of a case where you're going to different planets and you're trying to find resources and you're trying to find technology, and you're not just fighting an evil enemy in every single episode. But yeah, it's crazy that there isn't more promotion for this until you really know how terrible they have handled the Stargate universe. And in fairness, I would say Stargate as a sci-fi series has always been very sci-fi light, as it were. It's not trying to tell a particularly complicated story in any ways, and that made it fairly accessible to a lot of people new to sci-fi, but also made it feel completely unworthy of even mentioning in the same sentence of something like Star Wars or Star Trek, which there was just more going on in the Star Wars and Star Trek universes. And Stargate came out at a much later time compared to Star Wars and Star Trek. You would think for Stargate, though a stealth game seems to be about the worst concept where you could see something more like StarCraft, where you'd have humans and gold and maybe some other alien species all fighting like in StarCraft for territory in a real-time strategy game. Yeah, that's actually a genius idea. Just take the general concept of StarCraft and put Stargate themes over it, and then you could have Asgardians and gold and humans as three factions, and have advantages and disadvantages of the three factions, have them fight against each other in several story levels, have a cutscene in between each level telling the story. Yeah, that would work fairly well. Anyways, moving on. Let's see. Japanese Garden Simulator. Does this look good enough to say yes to it? No, I don't think it's quite good enough. Yeah. When I talk about there being just entirely different industries, Stargate game with no advertisement definitely feels like it should be in that A tier of industries, whether even if it is just a single A game compared to a random different person. Of course, nothing easily breaks down. It's not like there are true sorting limitations here. So I would question, as far as, would I put Palworld as a single A game in the A industry, or should there be something described as a B tier industry, which you typically see some game more close to this released on it. And what puts a game like that in the B tier, other than it's just not as ambitious? Like, calling them industries is probably the wrong term, and ambition should be, or perceived ambition, perceived scope. Yeah, perceived scope is probably the best version of this. I'm gonna make a YouTube short on this one, even though it's already mixed reviewed, because it is very much the perception of what the scope would be that changes how I feel about a lot of games on Steam. If I feel like it is a small game with like a minimal single puzzle game mechanic, I feel very different compared to a AAA game with giant open world elements. And if we go by perceived scopes, anything with an open world has a high chance of being at that higher tier of perceived scope just by having an open world element. But then even at that, there are plenty of asset flip games that have open worlds, and then there's just nothing in the open world to bring it up to a level of quality. Of course, that may just be, at that point, a open world game that is just bad and not worth mentioning at all. And I certainly can't relate or rate games based on quality without playing them. That would be insanity. All I can really do is, in my mind, categorize games based on the screenshots I see, and almost exclusively I'm not hearing any audio, and I'm not playing any of the interactivity elements. And you can't really sort it by price, because there are definitely a decent number of really good games that are free and really bad games that are expensive. We'll give that game a chance. A lot of times I'll describe something as looking like a joke or a troll game. And again, that is just an assumption that I almost certainly have been wrong about in the past. Or I'll describe something as looking like a mobile game, which that may too speak to a perceived scope. But yeah, overall, you have to admit that there is never going to be pure order in the universe, and you can only do your best, and only really need to do my best. Most of these games I will make a YouTube short on it, maybe put them in the follow list, and then remove them from the follow list 6 months to a year later. The vast majority of these games will never actually be in my library, but that doesn't mean that I can just ignore them from the beginning, because I still really want to know what the state of the internet really is, or the state of Steam and the state of games being released on Steam are, and I want to be informed when there is the occasional good game. And inherently, I am making YouTube shorts in the dozens every couple days when I live stream, so it's not a case by any means that it's like 100% garbage being released on Steam. It's probably much closer to 97%, maybe even as low as 95% garbage being released to Steam. And if I don't know how to curate it, then that probably means nobody else knows how to curate it. I think this might be one of these games as part of a series of games. I'm not sure. I'll give it a chance just because it might be connected to several other games. Here you have just a low effort asset flip of a 3D bikini girl in a asset flip beach farming sim, which that is new in itself. I don't think I've seen an asset flip farming simulation before. Yeah. So it's not 100% perception of just scope, it's also a perception of effort and achievement. Scope, satisfaction, and struggle. Maybe if we could try and find 3 S's. I don't know why I feel the need to alliterate there, but it's kind of a great example of like AI. There just is really no way that you could create an AI to look at all the screenshots on games and come out with anything that was consistently accurate as far as whether a game looks good or not. It could probably do a great job of generating tags, and at some level an algorithm with only AI image detection tags might be better. For instance, like an 8-bit graphics tag might play very well to identify only games with screenshots with 8-bit graphics would work. The identification of a humanoid figure is something that I think AI detection is pretty great at and has been trained on multiple times before. But telling the difference between a first-person shooter and a third-person shooter, things like that are not likely to really happen at all. Regardless of what kind of training happens. Okay, let's see how much We've got to go. So we'll cover the regular news, most of which we've already covered, I'm sure. Let's see, all-time now. It says that the all-time peak for PUBG Battlegrounds was 3.2 million, whereas Palworlds, according to SteamDB, has reached 2.0 million. And noticeably, the 24-hour peak for PUBG Battlegrounds is only 500,000, so people are definitely not playing it now. People are definitely playing Palworlds. And I'm not sure if this hasn't lowered the number of people playing Counter-Strike 2 by maybe a fairly significant amount. Or it might even be going the opposite direction and pulling players upward to playing other games. I could certainly see a case where people boot up their PCs to play Palworld, play it for a while, and then decide to play something different. And I could see people who had already booted up their PCs to play CSGO or Counter-Strike 2 and then got bored and played Palworld instead. Overall, the Space War game here might be new, which that would be somewhat surprising. Anything else still seems fairly consistent. Although Gary's mod is kind of surprising that it's way down there at 54. And my chart says Apex Legends is inching upward, where Arca Blade Point is inching downward, and GTA staying fairly stable at the lows. Yep. I really am at the point now where there's just no point in even showing my chart until I clean up some stuff. It's just ridiculous. There's too many points, too many days with bad sample data, and too many points here with numbers. And arguably, having the cutoff at the top being 450,000 is not helping me, and having the cutoff at the bottom being 100,000 is not helping me. If there is any help to really be had here. So far, ever since 9/16/2023, when this started sampling data, this chart has only shown me a real trend around Palworld when it first arrived, and I believe finals playtest here, and then the finals eventually showing up somewhere in the middle here. But I also don't think too many people are playing the finals. Let's see if this list is correct. Finals is fairly low down there, which this list may very well not be correct. Moving on to Video Games Chronicle, as far as video games news. Pretty much given up on getting Epic Game Store games with the glitch. For some reason it considers me failing the CAPTCHA over and over again. But apparently the next free game will be Doors Paradox. Okay. I might want to check that to see if that's on Steam. I would say this is Bluetooth customers are being charged for Xbox Game Pass without their knowledge. Customers are advised to check their accounts for any suspicious activity. I imagine BT does not stand for Bluetooth in this case. Probably is British Telecom, if I was to guess. But even that, I don't know why that would be the case. This is just another example of somebody using the shortened version of a title and not spelling it out at all. It's just terrible mainstream video game journalism in general. They're so bad at journalism. Yeah, spell things out. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is part of the style guides and the rules of writing is that you always spell out the thing the first time, and then you put the initials if you're going to use the initials later, which in video games would potentially mean that when you say something like EA Play, it should say Electric Arts Play, or Electronic Arts should be mentioned earlier. And in a digital format, it's easy enough to just make sure that there is the appropriate definition tag, which in HTML5 I think there literally is a definition tag where you can hover over something and get the definition of a word. Moving on, Spider-Man 2 has topped the Japanese weekly sales. This is a really differently formatted sales, software sales, being Spider-Man 2 for the PS5, and then we have a whole bunch of Switch for the rest of the top 10, and then hardware sales units seem to be fairly low. I don't get this order. They've got this sorted now by lifetime, so the original Switch selling only 4,000 units still gets a number one spot, when clearly the OLED model's selling way better. PS5 though doing even better this week, and Xbox Series X and S still doing better than they have in the past. It is questionable why they're even mentioning the new 2DS LL at this point, since the 3DS online store has been shut down. I would assume that the new 2DS online store has also been announced that it's being shut down, unless it has a different online store. Apparently, Xbox has reportedly shut departments dedicated to bringing games to physical retail. It's also claimed that certain AAA games have 80% digital sales shares on Xbox. Which, yeah, it's believable. That's the way Microsoft wanted to go, is completely all digital, and they are still trying to go in that direction. So maybe they're trying to force that to happen, or maybe there's some real truth to that. Noticeably, like on-shelf video games for Best Buy seem like they're going away. It would only be a matter of time before on-shelf games for Walmart might go away, and then that's really only going to leave GameStop, and if GameStop went out of business, that would basically leave nobody. Target maybe having some games on shelves. Now, a lot of people are still ordering online to get physical media. So there may be a long period in which you might go to bestbuy.com or gamestop.com and get a video game physical release that way, or amazon.com more realistically, or walmart.com, and have a physical disc just shipped to you in the mail, at which point having a department dedicated to bringing games to physical retail might not make so much sense. But yeah, it definitely feels like Phil Spencer also wants to go all digital, unless he surprisingly changes the momentum it seems like they're going. PlayStation gift cards have been discounted by 15% at the UK retailer Currys, but you'd think any discount card discounted could be a really good deal, although then you have to hassle with using a gift card. If I could get, say, Steam gift cards at a 10 to 15% discount, then buy a Steam Deck, that would be a nice extra discount, particularly if I'm already getting like a discounted Steam Deck otherwise because it's refurbished or just because there's a sale going on. You could potentially pay on top of paying there, or save on top of savings there. Typically, if you have like a cashback credit card though, and you get a gift card, you don't get cashback on that. Otherwise, you could figure out a system to make infinite savings. but probably not for the hassle. Both of those last two stories, though, definitely give a feeling that the world of shopping is changing a little bit more. So, and probably for the worse for people who want to go to stores or have multiple options. So it looks like Video Games Chronicles has just added this new gray bar as far as news and brief, as a horizontal bar amongst its mini ads and other distractions. So I suspect what I need to do is just take my element picker from uBlock Origin and see if we can pick the right thing and get rid of it. And then the actual story here is that Nintendo UK reveals Princess Peach Showtime pre-order items. Those who purchase from the official store will receive a pin and notebook, which those kinds of extra elements are very old ways of promoting games as far as collectibles. It definitely also feels a little weird that it might come off as a little sexist to go in that direction, and that girls, who you assume that's what Princess Peach Showtime is targeting, want pins and notebooks, whereas I imagine the newest generation of girls don't want pins and notebooks any more than little boys would, and instead they all want like smartphones and video games and more advanced things in general. Skull and Bones open beta and year one roadmap has been announced on Video Games Chronicle if you want to check that out. And then 15 minutes of uncut Persona 3 Reload gameplay was released. And then Codename Odyssey was reportedly in development for 6 years. It's kind of pointless to care about any of the information that may be leaking on a canceled game. Like, once a game is canceled, it's probably not coming back. And if we were going to go down the list of canceled games or just not released yet games from Microsoft, I think Perfect Dark Games would be more interesting to have information around. Killer Instinct games, there should have been at least one or two more of those. The unreleased Fable game is more interesting, which again, why are you going to have what looks like a fantasy MMO when you're focusing on that Fable reboot? There's probably a couple of Halo games that were secretly canceled that would be more interesting. It's just kind of all pointless to talk about that. We had already talked about whether I feel like there's a real difference between 7 inches and 8 inches diagonally on the screen. I imagine it will reduce the bezel and feel a little bit better, but I wouldn't be surprised if it leaves the actual physical dimensions of the next Nintendo console to be just about the same as it would be if it had a 7-inch LCD screen. The bigger complaint here is that it's an LCD screen, not that it's a small screen, because it's always going to be a small screen. We talked about this. The studio behind the popular VR social MMO Rec Room can't justify the cost of bringing it to the PS VR 2, which, yeah, I imagine is pretty expensive to make VR games, and you're not making a lot of profit from them. Apple now allowing game streaming apps, making Xbox Game Pass possible. Interesting to point out that. The Ruiner studio Recon Games has reportedly laid off around 80% of its staff. Around 60 to 70 employees are said to be affected. Inherently, this also paints a different picture, certainly for me. Like, I imagined eventually I'd get around to playing Ruiner, but is there really any reason to play the game if the money's not actually gonna go to support the people who made it? Sure, there's a reason still. If I want to be entertained, if I have something to say, there's reason. But it's a lesser reason, certainly. But then the problem with that way of thinking and that line of thinking is the false assumption that if I had pre-ordered Ruiner when it first came out, if I had bought the game in its initial launch window, that money I spent for the game would also be going to the 60 or 70 employees who potentially have been laid off now. And the answer to that is actually not true either. Like, game developers with the current publishing system get paid by the publisher in the years before a game is released. And those game developers, those programmers, get paid for that time, and that's it. If a game sells really well, then that increases the chance, the gamble, that they'll stay employed for the next game, and that they'll get a publisher to pay their wages for the development of the next game. But that's pretty much it. Even if you have a massively successful game that pays itself back to the publisher to the point where a massive amount of extra money is going into the pockets of the developer studio, the developer studio very rarely, in fact, I'm not sure I've ever heard a story of this actually happening, gives bonuses of any significant amount to developers or creators. There are no moral rights in the United States for being involved in the creation of a piece of art. You're just not going to get residuals, you're not going to get bonuses. Even if there was a residual system, they'd be getting pennies every year just because of crazy Hollywood math that would be involved at that point. So as a gamer, I'm much better saving my money and buying more games than I am pre-ordering something or buying it in the launch window. And then if a company goes belly up before I get around to playing the game, it doesn't really change too much, other than it's something I can mention while I'm playing a game, and it's something I can keep in the back of my mind as far as if a game ends on a cliffhanger, which most video games don't. You may want a sequel, but you usually don't really require one. Apparently, Quantic Dream's next indie release, the Hades-like Lisfangia, is going to be released in February. Hades is another great example of a game that was very well received, but I haven't played it, and I guess not that much would change if everybody in the company that made Hades also got laid off. I'd still want to play Hades 1 and probably Hades 2. Let's see. Does Video Games Chronicle give me Steam links? No, they never do. So I really can't react to the Forbidden West Complete Edition, which I should make a YouTube short on it and put it on the fault list at least. We had mostly talked about the rest of these, I think. Let's see if there's anything new. We talked about this in the last stream. Let's see. Oh, I did see that there was at least a hint or a tease that Pocket Pair, the company that makes Palworld, may also be working on a Pokemon trading card parody type game. It'll be interesting to see if that actually gets released or not, but yeah, they clearly know what they're parodying and what they're doing, and they're taking the risk, and maybe it'll pay off. So far it has paid off. The only thing that would be really crazy is if somehow they lost in court and then 8 million people who bought Palworld are forced to lose access to Palworld and its servers, and everybody's then mad at Nintendo, which is Nintendo's big risk there. Or all the profits from Palworld get handed to Nintendo, which may make Nintendo a small bit of change, but still probably would have Palworld taken down and lose them a ton of fandom. Nintendo is effectively in a lose-lose situation by letting the game get this far. If they could have DMCA'd or shut down the game, they should have done it as soon as it was first announced and shown. Because now you've got 8 million plus people who bought the game, and you can't, like, I guess maybe what Nintendo could do is win in court so well that they gain all the rights to Palworld, and then they continue to run Palworld as a Nintendo property, and perhaps just slowly evolve the code to actually have real Pokemon in it and actually be a real Pokemon game. And I say Nintendo, it really would be the Pokemon company, but I don't think the effective stealing of somebody else's software would even that would go over well, and I don't think the laws particularly allow for that, and that somebody can unjustly profit by forcing one company to hand over ownership of a game they made, or forcing a company to hand over a source code for a game they made. Anyways, let's get to the Gematsu articles. Honkai Star Rail version 2.0 update. If One Dreams at Midnight launches February 6th. I'd assume that Honkai Star Rail is somewhat popular. Persona 3 Reload gameplay has the first 50 minutes. Okay. Sin Duality Echoes of Ada has the Magnus and Cradle Coffin customization trailer. We may be seeing more trailers from Gematsu and Japanese companies for a while. A real-time turn-based hybrid premium 3D RPG called X Axtras launches February 27th for iOS and Android, which that is a mouthful certainly to describe what the game is. Noticeably too, it is fairly pretty looking trailer we have here, at least on the thumbnail, for what is an iOS and Android game. Yeah, just looking at the decoration and design of these rooms, it's way more ambitious than the 2017 Rethink game. And yeah, it is good to see even on mobile games in 3D that there is a much higher standard as far as just what is a background skybox minimally supposed to look like, and what is the design supposed to look like, and how polished should a game look. And it'll take me a while to get to the point where I expect all mobile games to be as polished as this one looks, but this one certainly looks very polished, at least in what they're showing off. And there might very well be just a major advantage now at this point, where if you design something pretty but at lower resolution, you may just not have to spend as much rendering time as you may have been in the past. At the very least, you have the built-in advantage that something could be scaled up to a PC 1080p resolution and it still would look rather good. You do also have a disadvantage though, where you're asking only $10 for a cell phone game, and still $10 is about $10 more than the average gamer is willing to spend. Here we have the Famitsu sales from the 15th to the 21st. I also see a Kirito Hung, I assume is how you pronounce that, saying good morning. I guess good morning for you. For me, it's late in the evening, but whatever. Let's see. we see Marvel Spider-Man being in our more normal format in the #1 spot, and then Nintendo Switch games taking the Japanese sales all the way down to spot 13, which then is Last of Us Part 2, and Another Code Recollection launching in the #4 spot. So that is much more popular than I thought it would have been. And then Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown launching for the Switch on the 27th spot, so not selling particularly well at all. I did see some more gameplay of this game, and it looks fine. It just doesn't look interesting at all. As far as hardware sales go, 45,000 units for the PS5, or only 30,000 units for the OLED model. The difference here will be once they stop selling the OLED models completely and they continue to sell PS5s, to see if they can catch up by the 2 million difference there, which that's just the OLED model. They really won't catch up anywhere close to the combined difference if you have the total sales of the Switch Lite and OLED model compared to the total sales of the PS5 and PS5 Digital Edition. And then Xbox is selling over 1,400 units, so that's big enough for Xbox to be somewhat happy. They're still beating out this week the PS4, and even the Series S is doing decent numbers, way better than the 16 units sold for the new 2DS LL. Although increasingly, if Microsoft is also getting rid of the departments that focus on physical sales, well, all the sales that Famitsu is collecting here is basically just Famitsu physical sales. So if all of a sudden the next Xbox is digital only, they would just fall off the charts and not be listed at all. And then they could use that certainly in Japan as an excuse as to why they never have a Xbox game making the top 30 sales units. Moving on, Shadow of Ninja Reborn has been delayed to summer, and they released a comparison trailer. Let's see if we have this game on the fall list already. Apparently not. There's quite a lot of games like this where it's side-scrolling, kind of platforming shooters. I don't know what my tolerance really would be for this. Prince of Persia, and the latest Prince of Persia game, kind of like that too, and that's certainly something I think about when I see the footage for Prince of Persia 2, is that I'm just not sure I really want side-scrolling hack and slash Castlevania style fighting that often. King of Fighters 15 major update launches January 30th, and it's adding an advanced strike system. It's kind of crazy in my opinion to add a whole new system to a fighting game once it's already been released, but whatever. K-Lab and Parket Pair have announced a joint development of a hybrid casual game for smartphone. Not really getting a major announcement there. Persona 3 Reload has its battle strategy trailer at Komatsu if you want to watch that, although it is age restricted on YouTube. A former Stardew Valley developer announces a city life simulation called Sunkissed City for consoles and PC. It's due out in Q4 of 2024, which I kind of question how different this really would be from just a Stardew Valley game. Just in a slightly different location, more urban environment. Do we have a Steam link? If anything, it feels like this is really just a split between somebody who worked on Stardew Valley but doesn't want to make this game under Concerned Ape, I guess would have been the company. Grand Blue Fantasy Relink live action TV, Japanese TV commercial is available on Gamatsu if you want to check that out. If you're really in for watching a weird TV commercial. We don't get too much of that, where Japanese commercials get mentioned even by Gamatsu. And this Baltro deck building card game. Looks like it might be something, but it looks like it might also just be quite boring. A poker roguelike. Baltro is hypnotically satisfying deck builder where you play illegal poker hands, discover game-changing jokers, and trigger adrenaline-pumping, outrageous combos. So you're effectively just like cheating by opening packs and getting more cards in a 52 card set. There's 150 jokers, each with their own unique abilities, 15 decks with distinctive modifiers, 22 tarot card variants that enhance your regular playing cards, 11 planet cards that help you level up your possible poker hands, and 32 voucher cards that help you provide permanent buffs for your current run. Interesting. So it feels like a weird twist on just playing poker, which inherently I have to point out there aren't that many good poker games on Steam, so I'd rather see somebody just make a good poker game that doesn't make you watch ads to refill your chips or buy microtransactions to refill your chips or gamble in any other way. I just want to pay a reasonable price, 20 bucks, whatever, to have a good poker game. And it's insane that Poker Night at the Inventory 1 or 2 from years and years ago still is probably your best bet if you want to play a poker game, and it's still not that good. And certainly if you were making a good poker game on Steam, it would make a lot of sense to have a mobile version that was cross-compatible too, if we're going to get greedy. Moving on, Kimono Heroes for the PS4 and 5 and the Xbox One and Series and PC is coming out in Q3 of 2024. Let's see what it looks like on Steam. Looks like it's a side-scrolling platformer game, beat-em-up game. Definitely some unique looking characters. Animal characters. An on-rail shooter called Candy Rangers has been announced for all consoles and PC. Which, okay. Q4 of 2024 is when it's expected. Yeah, I'm definitely not really seeing anything here that feels polished enough for me to even bother to make a YouTube short on it. I'm gonna just say no to this game. Let's see, a side-scrolling action and RPG called Wings of Endless has been announced for all consoles and PCs. Seems like we're seeing an increased trend in that all consoles are being included. It's important to also point out that I have a rewriting script running, so normally this would just list all the games in the headline, and instead it is just rewriting it to say all consoles and PC to make it easier to read. It's ridiculous to have to sit here and read out PS5, Xbox Series, PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC. Let's see. I never really had a lot of nostalgia for a lot of the old NES games, particularly ones I never played. This looks slightly interesting, but there are just still way too many games that try to lean on that old NES art style, and it just doesn't look great. There's ways to make those kinds of games with just higher resolution animation, better animation in general, less pixely. I would prefer that. a game called Berserk Boy is launching March 6th for Switch and PC. See what this one looks like. I've just seen a lot of platforming games, but even when you see platforming games, you never really can just assume that it's a Metroidvania or a beat 'em up or a platformer, because they all look the same but might play very differently in the challenges they actually give you. A game called Island of Insight launches February 13th, which, okay. I would almost think that that was going to be a puzzle game. And yes, it does seem like it's a puzzle game. If I recall correctly, this is a puzzle game that weirdly has this kind of open world avatars. You're flying around, and weirdly is multiplayer, but I'm not sure how multiplayer it really could be. It may just have other players walking around in your universe but not solving any puzzles, because it would be very irritating certainly if people were running up and solving puzzles before you even saw them. The easy anti-cheat and MMO aspect is questionable. The extra polish is questionable. The puzzles themselves might turn out to be way too easy for its own good, and the game may fail in its initial concept of being a puzzle game. Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition for PC launching March 21st. Which, this is already on the fall list, so I assume I've already made a YouTube short around this too. And then we've talked to death Microsoft laying off 1,900 staff. A game called Omega Crafter launches in early access on March 28th. Do we have that on the fall list? Yes, we do. I wonder if Palworld specifically has any backup plans. This is Banisher's Ghost of Eden new story trailer, where at some point they could just flip a switch on their server and then all the pals would look completely different. I don't know what would be acceptable to change there, because at a certain point then the pals would have to look particularly different. Otherwise they still have the same problem, and it would be potentially admitting defeat or that you were wrong if you flipped the switch to change the way the pals worked. Of course, another thing that defends Palworld is Digimon, for instance, which arguably maybe Digimon came before Pokemon did. They probably came out very close to each other, and there's just been this long-running case where both Digimon and Pokemon have existed, and neither one has ever actively tried to attack the other or sue the other. Yeah, inherently Nintendo has been sued for copyright infringement due to, I think it's Yuri Gregor, a self-proclaimed psychic who would bend spoons with his mind, he would claim. He wasn't really bending spoons with his mind, obviously. But that was preventing them from using one of their Pokemon that they created, so it would be certainly ironic if they then tried to sue somebody else for using a character that is slightly similar in looking. Barstella Abyss has its second trailer, but they don't have a link to Steam, and I don't recall seeing the first trailer on this game, but I guess we'll get more information later. Let's see, the Love Live School Idol Festival 2 Miracle Live is going to end service on March 31st in Japan and May 31st worldwide. Service to end 3 months after the global release in February. Which, yeah. definitely highlights that there's really no reason whatsoever to play the game. Atelier Resolurina, Forgotten Alchemy, and the Polar Knight Liberator is now available worldwide. Let's see if there's some reviews for it. 51% positive. Now, at a certain point, if it is a free-to-play game, it must be pretty bad for it to be that negatively reviewed. The Cut Content Police curator says shorts and other various clothing were added to characters that already wore leotards, which is redundant. Sueli using guns was changed to daggers, and then apparently there's no patch available. The link seems to just go to a Twitter post. Yep. So censorship, I imagine, is a major factor here. It's a shame. You would expect with the you would hope that the Atelier series, with its success in previous iterations and previous games, would have not caused any negative feelings with newer releases, and yet they've failed pretty terribly here. Or maybe this was just Koei Tecmo's plan in general, is to make a spin-off game that they could try and get some in-app purchases from, and nobody was willing to bite. I guess at this point, though, since it's already mixed, I doubt I would play this game, so I'm going to just take it off the following list now. Alright. That'll get me back to the news. Earth Defense Force 6 for the PS4 and PS5 launches March 14th in Asia with English audio and text, which probably indicates that it's not coming to a worldwide release. But nope, I guess I'm wrong about that, because there is a Steam listing here with coming soon, and it says it is going to support English. I always want these Earth Defense Force games to be a little bit better polished, and honestly, if they just took twice as long to make Earth Defense Force 7 and that advertised it a little bit better. There is an idea here of having games where you're fighting giant bug alien invaders with guns and robots and tanks. I think some tanks, mech suits. Let's see, the dungeon exploration and bakery management game called Aruta has a demo available now. You can't review anything until the game actually comes out. This is an interesting looking game, but I kind of question if it really supports English. This is also a great example of a game that might look good with its platforming elements, but that may just be all there is. And platforming for 6 or 7 hours is not appealing to me. Battleship Brigade was another game where you did some platforming, but it was very minimal. And then even at that, the puzzling and cooking elements of Battleship Brigade was also minimal, so there wasn't a lot of meat on the bone for Battleship Brigade for me to like. Let's see, something called Ilang launches February 8th for the Switch, iOS, and Android. It's a free-to-play multiplayer social deduction game. So, interesting. Yeah, another mobile game being announced. Game Warhaven is going to end service on April 5th. We're getting more announcements of ending of services now. And then, yeah, Palworld has sales have topped 8 million in less than 6 days. It'll be interesting to see by Monday if we've topped 9 million or if the momentum has to slow down because there just aren't that many people left that are likely to buy Palworld. The Boncho Tactics is coming to the Switch on February 15th. This doesn't really look like a game that would ever really interest me. Let's see the Steam page though, just to double check. We have a very positive strategy-based role-playing game with a Japanese gangster style high school. No, I just don't think I'm impressed enough with the visuals to say yes to this. So I'm going to take that off the default list regardless of the fact that it is 81% positive. And then Lisfangia, the Time Shift Warrior, launches February 13th. I had heard that from Video Games Chronicle, but they didn't have a link to the Steam store, and here Komatsu doesn't have a link to the Steam store, which that'll bring us to the GameDeveloper.com articles, which means we're probably close to being done, since we've mostly talked about all of these stories. Here's the story that I think GameDeveloper.com was far too eager to post without checking facts or at least getting a second person's opinions. The update here, CWA, Communication Workers of America, says that Microsoft and Activision Blizzard layoffs didn't impact union members. Your livelihood is not protected without a voice on the job. And then the update here is that the VFX artist Rachel Quietvis informed game developer that they were laid off despite being a CWA union member. So yeah, now that could have been something that they could have double checked before going forward with it, and that's just stupid on CWA's part too, as far as the union, that they shouldn't be allow themselves to be quoted as making some statement like that when you're obviously not going to be 100% sure in the chaos of a bunch of layoffs. Because in the chaos of a bunch of layoffs, even in a union job, there is, if 1,900 people are being laid off, there's a decent chance that one union member would be laid off, and that you would have to go through the whole process of fighting that person being laid off and reinstating them as an employee and saying, no, we're not going to allow this. This is against the union contract that the Activision agreed to. Just because Activision Blizzard King was acquired by Microsoft doesn't mean that they can nullivate the union contract they would have had before. It is also worth pointing out that CWA's union representation in video games is very new and only in some departments, really. Like mostly QA cases, I would say. Let's see. A dev claims that Apple has pulled a Unity in the EU with a new core technology fee. App Store devs interested in using third-party services in the EU are going to need to agree to new terms and a fee that could eventually cost them 50 cents or 50 European pounds. What do you call a euro? Do you call them euros for the coins? I don't know. Yeah, let's go with 50 euros per install. Which, yeah, clearly the concept of a per install fee is something that corporations are going to try and push more and more to just get more and more money. And I wouldn't be 100% surprised if at some point Steam literally is charging Steam Direct people in particular a per install fee for every game that gets installed from the Steam storefront. Let's see. We had already talked about Fortnite coming back as effectively a side-loaded app in Europe for iOS. No indication it's coming to any other region. Then we talked about this. And apparently Crafton wants to deepen AI relationship and franchise out PUBG, which is probably a smart move since PUBG at the moment is not being played that much. So whatever last bit of money you can get from PUBG, you should. Inherently, a lot of these survival games like PUBG always felt overly simplistic, kind of silly. They felt like things that would be flashes in the pan, and then eventually people would just get bored of them and move on to something that has like more of a story, more of a consistent visual theme, more of a consistent idea, and isn't just a survival game of the week. Talked about Apple allowing game streaming services in the App Store. We talked about this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And so that is going to be it for today, pretty much. Now I do have the follow list launching, but something about my macro is not actually opening any tabs from the follow list, so I haven't successfully done any follow list cleanup in quite a while. And then meanwhile, for the rest of today, I probably still need to play a little bit off screen, or quite a bit off screen, to try to get to this point. This ends in 2 days, so by the time I stream next this Monday, this theme event may be over, at which point we just play ranked and hopefully not fall out of platinum in playing ranked. Anyways, that's going to be it for this stream. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos so I can get that all important watch time up. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.